Hello everyone, I am the Creep's Cabin. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I woke up to a dull, pounding headache, the kind that wrapped around the back of my skull and squeezed like a vice. My mouth felt dry, my stomach uneasy, my body heavy from a long night of drinking. Sunlight streamed in from the blinds, cutting across the bed in sharp slats of white and gold, but I had no idea what time it was. The room was quiet, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only real sound, along with the occasional rustling of tree branches outside. I blinked at the ceiling, taking a few breaths, feeling the dull ache in my muscles, the kind that always came after a long night of alcohol. My head throbbed in time with my heartbeat. The sheets were warm against my skin, tangled around my legs, the weight of last night still pressing down on me. I was at my girlfriend's house, where I'd crashed more times than I could count. She and her roommates had gone to class hours ago, leaving me alone in the quiet of the empty house. It wasn't unusual for me to be here. No one ever really minded. The house itself wasn't anything special, a simple one-story rental in an older neighborhood, the kind with peeling paint on some of the houses, half-finished driveways, and the occasional junked-out car parked on the street. It wasn't a bad area, just a little rundown, a mix of college kids and older folks who had lived there forever. I shifted, running a hand down my face, trying to blink away the grogginess. My head still felt stuffed with cotton, and my stomach churned faintly, but it wasn't the worst hangover I'd ever had. The sheets smelled faintly of my girlfriend's shampoo, and I let myself sink into them for a moment, trying to will myself back to sleep. Then, suddenly, the dog started going crazy. It wasn't just barking. It was a panicked, high-pitched yelping, an unnatural kind of sound, sharp and frantic. Both dogs, her little Pomeranian and her cousin's Chihuahua, were going absolutely ballistic somewhere in the hallway. I heard their nails scrabbling against the hardwood floor, the way they skidded as they ran, their barks bouncing off the walls in rapid bursts. It was a sound I'd never heard from them before, desperate, high-pitched, almost painful. I frowned, still half asleep, trying to process what I was hearing. It wasn't unusual for them to bark, but this was different. This wasn't just barking at a squirrel outside or someone walking past the house. This was real panic. For a second, I thought maybe the mailman had come, or some delivery driver was too close to the front door. But even then, the dogs had never sounded like this before. My heart rate started to pick up, the dull hangover haze clearing just a little, something about the way they were yelping digging into the back of my brain like a warning siren. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. The sound wasn't stopping. If anything, it was getting worse, frantic, like they were being chased or hurt. Something about it made my stomach twist. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cool floor against my feet. I was still in my boxers, but I didn't care. I pushed myself up, my body sluggish, my head still heavy, and walked towards the bedroom door. The moment I cracked it open, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Two men, both crouched low, both gripping the dogs, one hand over their muzzles, trying to keep them quiet. They weren't supposed to be here. My brain locked up for a second, unable to fully register what I was looking at. They weren't wearing masks. They weren't sneaking around. They were just there, in the middle of the hallway, their hands wrapped around the struggling dogs, their bodies half turned toward me. They weren't kids. They weren't lost. They weren't salesmen. They were just two men, dressed in hoodies and jeans, crouched down in my girlfriend's house, holding her dog and her cousin's dog like they belonged there. Something in my brain kicked on, some instinct that buried the confusion under a layer of pure aggression. I wasn't thinking. I didn't even have time to think. The first thing out of my mouth was, "What's up?" I hadn't meant to say it that way. But the second the words left my mouth, I realized how aggressive I sounded. My voice came out deep, rough, mean. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even really a statement. It was just a noise, something that came straight from my gut, something that wasn't quite human, something that made it clear that I wasn't scared. I didn't feel scared. Not yet. I just felt off. For half a second, there was silence. The dogs were still struggling, still kicking against their hands, their tiny bodies wriggling and squirming. The two men stared at me, their eyes wide, their hands still gripping the dogs. They looked young, maybe mid-20s, but something about them felt older, harder, something in the way they carried themselves, the way they didn't freeze like a normal person might. And then they bolted. They didn't say anything. They didn't threaten me. They didn't make a move toward me. They just let go of the dogs and ran, crashing toward the front door, shoving past each other to get out, their sneakers slamming against the hardwood floor. The moment they let go, the Pomeranian took off, nails clicking against the floor, tail puffed out like a bottle brush, barking and yapping like crazy. The Chihuahua was gone. The door slammed open, and just like that, they were gone. I didn't chase them. I didn't even move for a second. I just stood there, my body frozen, my brain trying to catch up. They were inside the house. They had been holding the dogs. They had run when they saw me. They weren't friends. They weren't lost. They were here for something else. I exhaled, finally stepping back, my bare feet cold against the floor. I shut the bedroom door. Not locked it, just shut it. I don't know why. Maybe it was some stupid instinct, like that thin piece of wood could protect me if they came back. I stood there, breathing, my hands loose at my sides. My head was still throbbing. My stomach still felt weird, but I wasn't hungover anymore. I wasn't tired anymore. I was just alert. I walked to the window. The Pomeranian was outside now, trotting around in the grass, barking at something I couldn't see. The neighbors were standing in their driveway, looking at it. I took another breath, then stepped out of the bedroom, my body tense, my muscles still tight, my mind still trying to piece everything together. The house was empty. I checked the doors. Locked. Checked the windows. Closed. No sign of them. No sign of anything missing. Nothing out of place except for the fact that two men had been standing in the hallway, holding the dogs, and now they were gone. By the time my girlfriend and her cousin got home, the Chihuahua had been found. It had taken off in the chaos, but someone down the street had seen it and picked it up. It wasn't hurt. It wasn't even that scared. Just confused. That night, as I lay in bed again, staring at the same ceiling, I kept playing it over and over in my head. What if I hadn't woken up? What if I hadn't been here? What if I had hesitated just a little longer before opening the door? What if they had come with something more than just their hands? I didn't have answers. I just knew one thing for sure. I had never thought about locking the door before, but after that, I always did. The road into Arches National Park was dead silent at this hour. No cars, no crowds, no sounds except for the wind whispering through the desert. The full moon was high and bright, casting the red rock formations in an eerie silver glow. My partner and I had been trying for days to get into the park during the daylight, but the summer crowds had been relentless, turning us away each time. This was our last chance before leaving the area, so we decided to take a risk, sleep in the truck for a few hours and hike in the moonlight. We parked at Devil's Garden, the most remote trailhead in the park, and settled into the truck. The air was still warm from the day, but cooling fast, the desert dropping to that crisp, dry chill that settles deep in your bones if you're not prepared. I set an alarm, but I woke up before it even went off. When I opened my eyes, the world outside the truck windows was bathed in silver. The moon was impossibly bright, almost unnaturally so, casting sharp shadows against the rock. It wasn't just a bright night. It was the kind of night where you could see every detail, every crack in the sandstone, every twisted branch of a juniper. We laced up our boots and stepped out onto the trail, our voices hushed without even thinking about it. There was something about the silence that felt sacred. The usual chatter of the park, tourists, cars, people laughing, was gone. It was just us, the stone, and the wind. Even the insects seemed quieter here. Hiking under a full moon was surreal. The arches, which usually stood stark against the bright blue sky, were now black silhouettes against the silver-lit desert. They looked impossibly large, like massive gateways to something ancient, something that had been here long before us and would remain long after. Our shadows stretched long and dark across the sand, moving with us in an unnatural way. The sand crunched beneath our boots, the only sound besides the occasional gust of wind. We moved at a steady pace, taking in the beauty of it all, breathing in the cool, dry air. We weren't talking much. There was nothing to say. It felt wrong to break the silence, like we'd be intruding on something much bigger than us. Eventually, we reached the farthest part of the trail, near Landscape Arch. It was one of the most famous formations in the park, impossibly thin and fragile looking, stretching across the sky like a thread about to snap. We sat down on a rock nearby, letting the quiet settle over us, just watching the way the moonlight played over the stone. Then we turned back. The trail snaked through a narrow valley, bordered by low bushes and flanked by high cliffs. It was the kind of place where sound carried strangely. Our footsteps echoed off the walls. The wind made odd little noises as it twisted through the rocks. Somewhere above us, swifts were darting between the cliffs, their calls sharp and quick, the only real sound in the night. That's when I heard it. A tiny sound, almost nothing. A quick, soft noise in the bushes below the trail. If I had to describe it, it was like the sound of hands rubbing together, fast, light, dry. The kind of noise you wouldn't notice if you weren't already surrounded by silence. I stopped for just a second, listening. My partner didn't notice and kept walking, so I hurried to keep up. My brain tried to explain it away. A bird? A rabbit? Maybe just the wind moving through dry branches? It wasn't anything big. There was no heavy movement, no snapping twigs, just that faint rustling. We kept going, putting distance between us and the narrow valley, my heart settling back into its normal rhythm. And then we hit the same spot on the way back. This time, the sound was closer. That same dry, rubbing noise. But this time, it was right beside the trail. And the birds gone. 1 second they were calling, their high-pitched cries bouncing off the rock walls. The next, absolute silence. Like someone had flipped a switch. I don't know what it was about that moment, but every hair on the back of my neck stood up. My skin went cold despite the warmth of the night. Every instinct in my body locked onto one thing. There was something in the bushes. Something watching. Something waiting. My first thought, the only thought, was mountain lion. I didn't turn my head. I didn't look down at the bushes. I didn't want to. I just kept walking, kept putting one foot in front of the other, willing myself not to react, not to run. Running was the worst thing you could do. If it was a mountain lion, running would flip a switch in its brain, prey. I started clapping my hands together. Loud, sharp claps, one with each step. A rhythm. Something that said, asterisk, I see you. I am not weak. I am not prey, asterisk. I could feel it behind us. Not in my ears, not in my eyes. Somewhere deeper than that, some part of my brain that hadn't been needed in 1,000 years. Some leftover instinct from a time when we weren't at the top of the food chain. It was following us. Not rushing, not running, just moving when we moved, stopping when we stopped. My partner fell into step beside me, our pace perfectly in sync. We weren't talking, but we both knew. Every step was calculated, every movement careful. We weren't prey. We weren't weak. The hike back to the parking lot felt endless. The sensation of being watched, of being hunted, was unbearable. My body was screaming at me to run, to just bolt and sprint for the truck. But I didn't. We didn't. We kept moving, kept clapping, kept walking. The trail finally opened up near the parking lot. The walls fell away, the bushes thinned, the moonlight stretched farther, and the moment we crossed that threshold, the feeling stopped. Just like that. It was gone. I don't mean the noise stopped. I don't mean the movement stopped. I mean that deep, gut-level awareness of being stalked just melted away the second we stepped into the open. I didn't need to look behind me. I knew. It wasn't following us anymore. We made it to the truck, opened the doors, climbed inside. My hands were shaking. My whole body was. The night was quiet again. Peaceful. Just the wind, the sand, the arches. The next morning, we told a ranger. She didn't even hesitate. Yep, she said, like she'd heard it 100 times before. Mountain lion. That was the last night hike I ever did. When I was 15, my life took a turn into a relentless nightmare. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, but soon escalated into a daily ordeal that haunted me for over a year. It started with fleeting glimpses, a gold Dodge Intrepid parked across the street, the same car trailing a few vehicles behind as I walked to school. At first, I dismissed these sightings as coincidences. After all, gold was a common car color, and the Dodge Intrepid wasn't exactly rare. But as days turned into weeks, an unsettling pattern emerged. There were two of them. The first was a man in his early 30s, dark hair neatly combed, a mustache that gave him a distinguished yet intimidating appearance. The second was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a full head of white hair that contrasted sharply with his tanned skin. Both drove gold Dodge Intrepids, though of different years. The younger man's was a 1999 model, while the older man's appeared to be from 2000. Their presence became a constant in my life. Every morning, as I left for school, one of them would be there, idling a few houses down the street. In the afternoons, I'd spot them in my peripheral vision, maintaining a calculated distance as I walked to the local convenience store or met up with friends. They never approached me, never spoke a word, but their silent surveillance was suffocating. For the first month, I questioned my sanity. Was I imagining things? Were these men truly following me, or was it a figment of an overactive teenage imagination? I confided in friends and family, but no one had seen them. Their absence in others' eyes made me doubt my own. Then came the day that validated my fears. I was walking with my boyfriend Jake through our neighborhood, a 6-block stretch we often traversed. As we chatted, I noticed the older man's gold Intrepid circling the area. I pointed him out to Jake, who shrugged it off as coincidence. But as the car passed us for the 15th time in that short span, Jake's skepticism waned. The reality of my situation began to sink in for both of us. From that point on, others started noticing. My mom, always perceptive, caught sight of the cars during her evening walks. My brother, ever the skeptic, admitted to seeing them near our house on multiple occasions. Friends would mention a gold car parked nearby whenever we hung out. Even the local police, after I filed a report, acknowledged their presence but could do little without concrete evidence of a crime. Winter arrived, bringing with it early nights and biting cold. One night, after a heated argument with my mom, I stormed out of the house around 1 a.m., seeking solace in the crisp air. The streets were deserted, the silence amplifying my thoughts. I had walked about 3 blocks when I saw him, the dark-haired man, sitting in his car, engine running, eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through me. The reality of my isolation hit hard. I had no cell phone, no means to call for help, and the neighborhood was asleep. I turned on my heel and started running towards home, darting between houses, cutting through back alleys, hoping to lose him in the labyrinth of our suburb. But every time I emerged onto a street, there he was, anticipating my moves, his car always a step ahead. I made it home, breathless and trembling. The weight of the past months crashed down on me. For nearly a year, these men had shadowed my every move, turning my life into a surveillance reel. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant vigilance, it all became too much. In that moment, a resolve hardened within me. If they intended to harm me, I was done playing the passive victim. The next day, as I walked to the corner store, the older man followed, his car maintaining a slow crawl behind me. At an intersection, he pulled up beside me, rolled down his window, and smiled, a gesture that sent chills down my spine. Without thinking, I lunged at the car, slamming my elbow into the driver's side window, screaming obscenities, daring him to act. He simply laughed, a deep, mocking sound, waved nonchalantly, and drove off, leaving me seething in the middle of the street. After that confrontation, their behavior changed. They still followed me, but there was a noticeable distance, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Months passed, and their appearances became sporadic. The following spring, the older man approached me on foot for the first and only time, offering me a ride. I declined curtly, and from that day on, their presence faded, eventually disappearing altogether. Years have passed since that harrowing period, but the memories remain vivid. The sight of a gold Dodge Intrepid still sends my heart racing. I never discovered who they were, what they wanted, or why they chose me. The unanswered questions linger, a testament to a chapter of my life shrouded in mystery and fear. Even now, over a decade later, I occasionally find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those familiar faces, a reminder that some shadows from our past never fully fade. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A few days alone in the wilderness, away from the constant noise of daily life. No phone buzzing, no emails, no people. Just me and the woods. I had camped alone before, and I always found it refreshing, even necessary. The isolation wasn't something that bothered me. In fact, I liked it. The quiet was something I craved. I had chosen a spot near the Appalachian Trail, just off a gravel road that saw little traffic. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. I had packed enough food for a few nights, brought plenty of water, and had a solid plan. Hike during the day, set up camp by evening, cook a simple meal, and enjoy the silence. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent in a clearing a short walk from where I had parked my car. I built a small fire, cooked some instant rice with chicken, and spent some time staring up at the sky. There was something about being alone in the woods that made you hyper-aware of everything. The rustling leaves, the distant sound of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the darkness. But none of it unsettled me. The second day, I went on a long hike, covering miles of trail that wound through thick forest and along ridges that overlooked valleys stretching far into the distance. The views were incredible. The air was crisp, carrying that cool, earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. I barely saw any wildlife, just a few squirrels and some birds fluttering between trees. It was perfect. By the time evening came, I was tired but satisfied. I returned to camp, made another small fire, ate, and decided to take a short walk down the gravel road before turning in for the night. I hadn't explored that part yet, and I figured I'd check it out while there was still a bit of light left. The road was wide enough for a car to drive down, though I doubted many did. It was mostly flat here, with a steep incline on the right side leading up into thick forest. The left side sloped downward more gradually. The trees on both sides were dense, their branches arching overhead, creating a tunnel-like effect as I walked. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. A few minutes into the walk, I got that feeling. It was subtle at first, just a vague unease, like an itch in the back of my mind. I kept walking, but the sensation didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I stopped. The forest was still. Too still. That was the first thing that made me realize something was wrong. No rustling. No insects. No distant hoot of an owl. Just silence. I turned my head slightly, scanning the woods on either side. It was getting dark, but there was still enough light to see outlines and shapes. My eyes moved up the incline on the right, following the steep rise of dirt and fallen leaves. Then I saw them. A pair of eyes, big, round, and reflecting the dim light like glass. I froze. They were maybe 15 feet back from the edge of the incline, partially hidden behind a tree. At first, I couldn't make out the shape of the animal. Just those glowing eyes, locked onto me. Watching, my heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay still. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running was the worst thing I could do. I shifted my stance slightly, keeping my eyes on it, and finally, I made out the shape of its head. A cat. A big one. I still couldn't tell exactly what kind. The light was too dim, and the way it was positioned made it hard to judge its size. But it wasn't a house cat, that was for sure. I needed something. A weapon, anything. I spotted a thick tree limb on the ground a few feet away. I didn't dare bend down to grab it. Instead, keeping my back straight and my eyes locked on the cat, I slid my foot under the limb and kicked it up. It flipped into the air, and I caught it with both hands. I raised it above my head and waved it, trying to make myself look as big as possible. I stomped forward, shoving it out toward the animal. I yelled, voice sharp and loud, cutting through the silence. The cat didn't move at first. I waved the limb again, took another step toward it, and shouted even louder. Then finally it turned. Slowly, almost lazily, it took a few steps backward. Then, with a fluid, effortless motion, it disappeared into the trees. I stood there, heart still hammering, gripping the branch so tightly my fingers hurt. I waited, listening. I couldn't hear it anymore. But that didn't mean it was gone. I backed away, step by step, never turning my back to the incline. When I reached my campsite, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and got into my car, slamming the door and locking it. My tent was still set up, the fire still smoldering, but I didn't care. I wasn't sleeping out there. Not that night. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing. Through the windshield, the dark forest stretched out ahead of me. Every shadow seemed deeper now. Every sound felt amplified. I sat there for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear. I tilted my seat back and dozed off, waking every so often at the slightest noise outside. By morning, I had made my decision. I packed up. I wasn't staying another night. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I just gathered my gear, stuffed everything into the trunk, and got the hell out of there. I never saw the cat again. I never heard it. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, that stayed with me. I still don't know what kind of cat it was. Maybe a mountain lion. Maybe a bobcat. Maybe something else. I only know one thing for sure. It was there, watching, waiting. I was 12 years old when it happened. It wasn't the first time something strange had happened to me, and it wouldn't be the last, but it's the one that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It was a birthday party. One of my friends had invited a group of us to her house for a sleepover, about 8 of us in total. The house was big, much bigger than mine, multi-story with wide, open rooms and long hallways. It had that kind of feeling that big houses sometimes have, like too much space, too many corners and dark areas where things could be watching, even if you knew logically there was nothing there. I had never really liked big houses for that reason. They always felt empty, even when they weren't. My sister was at the party too, and we were both a little uneasy from the start. The house just had a strange vibe. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, but I didn't like it. Neither did she. It wasn't something we said outright, just something we understood between us, exchanging quick glances when the other girls excitedly ran around exploring. It was the kind of quiet agreement that didn't need words. As the night went on, we ate pizza, watched a movie, did all the usual things. The parents were there, but mostly stayed upstairs or in their room, letting us have our fun. At some point, someone suggested playing hide and seek in the dark. It was the kind of thing that sounded fun in theory, but deep down, I already knew I didn't want to play. The house felt different at night. The wide, open spaces seemed even bigger in the dim light, and the halls stretched longer, like they could go on forever. I wasn't the only one hesitant. My sister looked at me when the game was announced, and I could tell she wasn't thrilled either. But we weren't the type to make a big deal out of things. The group was excited, and it was easier to just go along with it than to say no. We split up to hide. The lights were turned off, the only glow coming from the moonlight outside and the occasional sliver of brightness seeping through door cracks. The house was eerily quiet. I wasn't about to hide alone. That much was certain. A couple of the other girls must have felt the same way because we ended up huddled together, deciding to hide in our friend's closet. It was one of those long closets that stretched across the length of a wall with sliding mirror doors. It seemed like a good enough spot. We pulled open one of the doors, stepping inside one by one. I went in first, scooting all the way to the end to make room for the others. The closet wasn't huge, but it fit us all. We shut the door, standing pressed together in the darkness. For a while we stood there, stifling giggles, waiting. I could hear the others breathing, small shifts as someone adjusted their stance, but otherwise we were still. The air inside was stuffy, warm from all of us crammed together. Then I felt it. A hand. A clear, distinct pressure pressing against my back. It wasn't a quick touch, not an accidental brush of fabric or a bump from someone shifting. It was firm. It pushed against me like someone had placed their palm there and was holding it. I froze. My first instinct wasn't even fear. It was just confusion. The touch stayed for a few seconds, and then it lifted. I remember standing there, still feeling the warmth of it even after it was gone. My mind immediately tried to make sense of it. Someone must have touched me. One of the girls. That had to be it. I reached back, my hand fumbling in the dark, expecting to bump into whoever was behind me. But there was nothing. No one was there. I swallowed hard, my fingers brushing against the fabric of the hanging clothes instead. My heartbeat picked up, a slow, creeping dread settling in my stomach. I knew the others were there, packed together at the opposite end of the closet. I could hear them whispering, giggling softly, unaware. I wasn't touching anyone, and no one was touching me. My throat felt dry. I turned my head slightly, barely whispering, "Guys?" Their voices responded, all coming from the far end of the closet. My body went cold. I didn't wait. I pushed the sliding door open, stepping out into the room, barely caring about the game anymore. I didn't say anything. I just walked out, trying to slow my breathing, trying to ignore the way my back still tingled from the sensation. I told my sister later, in private. She wasn't surprised. We both had our share of strange experiences before, and we both already had a weird feeling about the house. I didn't tell the others. I wasn't sure they would believe me. It wasn't something I could explain. There had been no sounds, no movement, nothing else to suggest anyone, or anything, had been in that closet except for us. But I knew what I felt. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. It was real. It was a hand, and it had been pressed firmly against my back. I still think about it sometimes. The way it felt. The way it stayed, just long enough for me to know it was real. The way my hand reached back and touched nothing. Some things don't have explanations, and I don't think I'd want to know the answer even if they did. I was lying in bed next to my boyfriend, Jay. The lights were off, and we weren't talking. We weren't even touching at first, just lying there in the quiet, each lost in our own thoughts. It was one of those moments where you feel completely still, like the whole world has stopped moving for just a little while. The only sound was the faint hum of the fan in the corner, its slow, steady rhythm blending with the occasional creak of the house settling. It had been a long day, but not an eventful one. Nothing had happened to put me on edge. Nothing had unsettled me. I hadn't been thinking about anything scary, hadn't watched a horror movie, hadn't even read anything creepy online. If someone had asked me how I was feeling just 5 minutes earlier, I would have said calm. A little tired maybe, but nothing else. Then Jay rolled over suddenly and wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight. It was so quick, so out of nowhere, that it took me by surprise. But I didn't question it. I just hugged him back. He was always warm, always felt solid and steady. It was comforting, familiar. And then something changed. It hit me so hard it almost knocked the breath out of me. A feeling. Not just unease, not just a slight discomfort. This was something else. A wave of dread, something so thick and overwhelming that it felt like the air itself had changed. My stomach clenched. My skin went ice cold, even though Jay's body was pressed right up against mine. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping onto him like he was the only thing anchoring me to reality, like if I let go, something terrible would happen. I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't one of those moments where your mind plays tricks on you in the dark, where you think you see a shadow move in the corner, or hear something faint that turns out to be nothing. This was real. I could feel it, pressing in from somewhere in the room, heavy and awful. I could feel it the same way you can feel someone standing behind you before you turn around. The worst part was the certainty of it. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't wondering if maybe I was just being paranoid. I knew something was there, and it was in the corner. I didn't look. I couldn't. I was terrified that if I turned my head, if I even so much as glanced in that direction, I would see something I couldn't take back. The weight of it, the presence of it, was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a bad feeling. It was something wrong, something that shouldn't have been there. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. Jay didn't say anything, but I could feel him tense up too. He was gripping me just as tightly as I was gripping him. I could tell he felt it too. I wanted to speak, but my throat was dry, my mouth frozen. The silence in the room was unbearable. It wasn't just quiet, it felt dead, like the entire house was holding its breath. I finally forced out the words, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jay, do you feel that?" His body stiffened. He didn't answer right away, but after a long moment, he gave a single, slow nod. That was when I knew I wasn't just imagining it. I wasn't having a panic attack, wasn't overthinking things. If he felt it too, then it was real. The cold was the worst part. I was under the blankets, wrapped up in Jay's arms, but it felt like I was standing outside in the middle of winter without a coat. My fingers were numb. The room felt wrong, like something was pressing into it from the outside, something heavy and dark. It all happened in less than a minute, but it felt like forever. I couldn't stay in the dark. I had to see, had to break whatever hold this thing had over the room. I forced myself to move, peeling away from Jay just enough to reach over and turn on the lamp beside the bed. The second the light flooded the room, it was like something snapped. The air shifted, the weight lifted slightly, but not completely. The corner, the place where I knew it had been, was just a shadowy space like any other part of the room. But it still felt off. Jay didn't move at first, just lay there, breathing heavily. I could feel his heart pounding against my arm. We needed to do something. We couldn't just sit there. Jay grabbed his phone and called his friend Matt. I didn't know Matt well, but I knew he was studying to be a youth pastor. Jay put him on speaker, his voice shaking as he explained what was happening. Matt didn't hesitate. He started praying. I closed my eyes, gripping onto Jay's arm as I listened. I wasn't the most religious person, but I didn't care. I just wanted this feeling gone. As he spoke, the room started to feel different. The cold eased, the weight pressing down on my chest lightened. The air no longer felt thick and suffocating. By the time he finished, the room felt almost normal again. Almost. We sat there in silence for a minute, just breathing, letting the tension drain from our bodies. Then Matt spoke again. "Were you two talking while I was praying?" I frowned, glancing at Jay. "No," Jay said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Matt finally said, "I heard something. A voice. It told me to stop. My stomach dropped. And while I was praying, I felt it too, Matt continued. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't good. The words sent a fresh wave of chills through me. Jay hung up a few minutes later. He was shaken, but I could tell he was trying to act normal. He grabbed his keys, muttering something about needing to get out of there. I was pissed. He was leaving. I was scared too, but he was just going to drive off and leave me alone in that room. He barely even looked at me as he grabbed his things and walked out the door. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the corner of the room. The feeling was gone, but the memory of it wasn't. Eventually, I forced myself to get up. I walked down the hall to my dad's room, my hands still shaking a little. I pushed open the door and whispered, "Dad." He grumbled something, barely awake. I think there was something in my room. He barely reacted, just rolled over and muttered, "If it comes back, I've got a gun." That was it. That was his answer. I stood there for a second, then turned and walked back to my room. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on. Nothing happened again. I never felt it again, but I never figured out why. Why did it come? What did it want? And why did it leave? I don't think I'll ever know. I had been walking for hours. My boots were soaked through from the damp ground, and every step I took squelched against the soft earth. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves, decaying wood, and the faint, almost metallic scent of groundwater seeping from the hillside. This was part of the job, mapping wetland boundaries, marking the flow of springs and seeps, flagging areas for restoration. It was routine, something I had done hundreds of times before, but today felt different. I was alone, which wasn't unusual. Most days in the field, I worked by myself, following water through the terrain, tracing its source and documenting its movement. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds, the rustle of the wind in the trees, and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I had set out early in the morning, parked my truck a few miles back along a dirt access road, and hiked in with my gear, shovel, flagging tape, GPS unit, and a few basic supplies. My plan was simple. Follow the water, mark the boundaries, and get out before dark. The area I was surveying had once been private land, an old farm, long abandoned, now part of a larger conservation project. Decades of neglect had let the wetlands reclaim what was theirs, and my job was to make sure the restoration work didn't interfere with the natural flow of water. There was an old reservoir at the base of the mountain, fed by a network of small springs trickling down from the hillside. That's what I was tracking, small veins of water cutting through the dense undergrowth, leading me deeper and deeper into the woods. I had just crested a small rise when I saw it. At first, I thought it was an old hunting camp, just a clearing filled with scattered junk. Rusted out furniture, a refrigerator missing its door, beer cans crushed flat against the dirt, and a pile of old tobacco tins stacked near what looked like a makeshift fire pit. It wasn't unusual. People used to own this land, and even after it went public, hunters, squatters, and drifters still passed through. I had seen plenty of these kinds of places before, old camps, forgotten by time, swallowed by the woods. But something about this one felt wrong. There was no sign of recent activity. The rust on the furniture told me it had been there for years, maybe decades, but the ground around the site was disturbed in a way that didn't match the decay. The dirt looked like it had been turned over recently, as if someone had been digging. I took a step forward, scanning the ground for any sign of fresh tracks, when I heard a noise behind me. A low, deliberate growl. I turned slowly, my grip tightening around the handle of my shovel. A German shepherd stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at me. Its coat was clean, too clean for a stray. No matted fur, no signs of malnourishment. This was someone's dog, and it was big. I didn't move. I had seen what wild dogs could do. I had seen their teeth rip through muscle, seen the aftermath of attacks on livestock. If this thing decided to come at me, my shovel wouldn't do much. But it didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, ears up, tail still. Then it turned and looked back over its shoulder. It wanted me to follow. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around, walk back down the hill, and leave. But there was a part of me, a small, gnawing voice in the back of my mind, that told me I had to see where it was leading me. If this was someone's dog, maybe its owner was in trouble. Maybe there was a hunter injured somewhere up the hill. I took a slow step forward, and the dog turned, trotting up the slope, glancing back every few feet to make sure I was following. The ground grew steeper, the underbrush denser. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing and the soft crunch of my boots on damp leaves. And then I saw them. Dolls. Dozens of them. They were half buried in the dirt, their heads sticking up, their glass eyes staring blankly at the sky. Their arms were raised, stiff and plastic, all pointing in the same direction. Up. I stopped, my stomach twisting. The dog stood a few feet ahead, waiting. I forced myself to move forward, stepping carefully between the dolls, feeling their dead eyes on me as I passed. The earth around them was disturbed, as if they had been placed there deliberately. I looked up, following their outstretched arms, and saw it. A deer carcass. It was hanging from a tree, looped over a thick branch, its body contorted in a way that didn't seem natural. The skin had been stripped in places, revealing raw, dark muscle beneath. The eyes were gone. The smell hit me a second later, a sharp, rancid mix of decay and blood. I turned around and walked. Not fast, not running, just walking. I kept my breathing steady, kept my steps even, moving back the way I came, past the dolls, past the dog, past the old camp. I didn't stop until I saw the reservoir. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw my gear into the back, slammed the door, and started the engine. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what I had just walked into. I didn't want to know. I was getting married in a month. I had a life outside of this job, outside of these woods, and I wasn't about to risk it trying to figure out who, or what, had left those dolls in the ground, or why they had strung up that deer like some kind of offering. The job was done. I was never coming back. I don't think I can point to just one experience that made me wary of people in the backcountry. It's more like a slow accumulation of little moments, each one settling in my gut like a stone. Maybe it's the silence, the way the normal rules of life start to feel distant when you're miles away from civilization. Or maybe it's the fact that out there, no one's watching. I've had plenty of weird encounters while hiking solo, but there's one that still sticks with me. It was late September, cool enough that the crowds had thinned, but not so late in the season that I had to worry about snow. I'd planned a 3-day solo loop through a national forest, a mix of well-marked trails and lesser-used paths that wound through deep valleys and ridges. I liked hikes like this, long, quiet, without the pressure of needing to keep up with anyone. Just me, my pack, and the sound of my boots on dirt. The first day went fine. I started mid-morning, hiked about 12 miles, and set up camp in a small clearing near a stream. I ate my usual meal of instant rice and tuna, packed away my food, and crawled into my tent before it was fully dark. I was tired in that good way, legs aching, mind clear. I slept deeply. Day 2 was when things got strange. I hadn't seen another person since I started the hike. It wasn't unusual for this trail, especially in the off-season, but it still gave me that slightly unsettling feeling. Out here, it was just me. No cell service, no nearby towns. Just endless miles of trees, stretching in every direction. I woke early, packed up, and got moving before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The morning was misty, the kind where everything felt muted. The world was quiet, just birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. A few hours in, I stopped to rest on a large rock near a switchback. I pulled out a granola bar, took a sip of water, and looked around. That's when I noticed it. Farther down the trail, maybe a quarter-mile away, someone was standing just off the path. I squinted. It was hard to make out details from this distance, but they weren't moving, just standing there, watching. My stomach tightened. There was no reason to assume anything was wrong. This was public land. Anyone could be out here. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I'd been hiking since dawn, and this was the first person I'd seen. No campsites, no side trails that they could have come from. Just there. I lingered for another minute, hoping they'd move, do something that made them seem normal, adjust their pack, pull out a map, take a drink of water. But they didn't. I wasn't about to sit around waiting, so I stood, slung my pack on, and started walking again. I kept my pace steady, natural. Not rushing, not acting like I was bothered. As I made my way down the switchback, I lost sight of them behind the trees. When I rounded the next bend, they were gone. I told myself they had just kept walking. Maybe they hadn't even noticed me. Maybe they were just taking a break, the same way I had. But the feeling in my gut didn't go away. I hiked another 6 miles before stopping for lunch near a small lake. I picked a spot with a clear view of the trail behind me, just in case. Nothing. No one. By the time afternoon rolled around, I'd mostly convinced myself I'd overreacted. Being alone in the woods messes with your head. You get jumpy, start seeing things that aren't there. I pushed on. Around 4 p.m., I reached the part of the trail where I planned to camp. It was a small flat area near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by thick trees. I set down my pack and took a deep breath. This was my favorite part of hiking, setting up camp, the quiet of the evening settling in. I was rolling out my sleeping bag when I noticed it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth near where I had just set my pack down. I stared at them, heart pounding. The prints were deep. Whoever left them had been carrying weight. A pack, probably. They led in from the trees and stopped just a few feet from my campsite. I looked around, scanning the trees, the shadows between them. I didn't see anyone. I told myself they could have been old. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier in the day. Maybe. But no. The ground was damp from last night's dew. If they had been here this morning, they'd be fading. These were fresh. Someone had been standing here, watching. A prickling sensation crawled up my spine. I didn't unpack the rest of my gear. I didn't eat. I just slung my pack on and started walking. I didn't run. Running makes you look like prey. But I moved fast, taking a different route than I had planned. I had a map, and I knew there was another trail that would loop me back toward my car if I took it. It would add a few miles, but I didn't care. I hiked until the light started to fade. I didn't see anyone else. No footprints. No signs of movement. Just trees. Just silence. When it got too dark to keep going safely, I forced myself to stop. I picked a spot off trail, deep in the underbrush. I didn't set up my tent. I just unrolled my sleeping bag on the bare ground, laid my pack beside me, and kept my knife close. I barely slept. Every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper of movement. Morning came slow. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, weak and gray. I packed up, my hands stiff from gripping my knife all night. I didn't eat. I just walked. The last 5 miles felt endless. Every so often, I stopped listening. I still felt watched. Finally, I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, undisturbed. The parking lot was empty. I locked the doors the second I got inside. I sat there for a long moment, just breathing. Then, with shaking hands, I started the engine and drove away. I still don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know one thing. It's always people. I had always considered the path behind the Walmart a convenient shortcut. Nestled amidst a dense cluster of trees, it provided a serene, albeit slightly eerie, passage to the store. The towering pines and oaks formed a natural canopy, their leaves rustling softly in the wind, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. The trail itself was a narrow dirt path, worn down by the footsteps of countless locals who, like me, preferred this secluded route over the bustling main road. One humid summer evening, my boyfriend and I decided to indulge in some root beer floats. The craving struck around 9 p.m., and though the sun had set, the residual heat lingered in the air, making the idea of a cold treat even more appealing. We set off towards Walmart, our footsteps crunching softly against the gravelly path. The cicadas were in full chorus, their incessant chirping filling the night air, occasionally accompanied by the distant hoot of an owl. As we neared the midpoint of the trail, where the trees seemed to huddle closer together, casting deeper shadows, I noticed movement up ahead. Squinting, I could make out the silhouette of a black dog, its form barely distinguishable against the dark underbrush. It was sniffing around, seemingly engrossed in whatever scents the ground held. Trying to lighten the mood, I nudged my boyfriend and whispered, "What if it's some sort of creature?" My voice carried a playful lilt, aiming to dispel the creeping unease that the dark forest often instilled. To our astonishment, the dog immediately lifted its head, its eyes locking onto ours. For a heartbeat, we stood frozen, the cicada's song fading into the background as an oppressive silence enveloped us. Then, without warning, the dog bolted. It moved with such speed and fluidity that it seemed to blur into the shadows, disappearing down the trail ahead. We stood there, dumbfounded, the image of its piercing gaze and swift departure replaying in our minds. Shaking off the encounter, we continued to the store, attributing the dog's behavior to our sudden presence startling it. However, the incident left a lingering sense of unease, a nagging feeling that something was amiss. Months passed, and the memory of the black dog began to fade, overshadowed by the routine of daily life. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves painted the ground in hues of amber and gold, I struck up a conversation with my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She was a kind woman in her late 50s, always eager to share stories from her youth or discuss the latest happenings in the neighborhood. As we chatted about the changing seasons and upcoming community events, she mentioned an unsettling experience. "You know," she began, her brow furrowing slightly, "my son and I were walking behind the Walmart the other evening, and we saw the strangest thing, a large black dog, just lurking near the trees." A chill ran down my spine. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked, "Did it do anything unusual?" Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, it did. The moment it noticed us watching, it took off like a shot. I've never seen an animal move that fast. It was unnatural. We exchanged theories, from wild dogs to escaped pets, but neither of us could shake the feeling that there was something more to these encounters." A few weeks later, as winter's chill began to creep into the air, my boyfriend came home, his face pale and eyes wide with alarm. "I saw it again," he said breathlessly. "The black dog. It was just standing there, watching me. And when I tried to get closer, it vanished into the woods." The frequency of these sightings began to weigh heavily on my mind. Each account was eerily similar: the dog's sudden appearance, its intense stare, and its inexplicable speed. I couldn't help but feel that these encounters were more than mere coincidences. Determined to find answers, I delved into local legends and folklore. I discovered that tales of spectral black dogs were not uncommon, often seen as omens or guardians, depending on the region. However, our experiences didn't quite fit any of the traditional narratives. The dog's behavior was neither overtly malevolent nor protective. It was simply there, observing. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront my unease head-on. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of resolve, I ventured onto the trail alone. The forest was eerily silent, the usual nocturnal sounds conspicuously absent. As I walked, the beam of my flashlight danced over the path, casting elongated shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with each step. Halfway down the trail, I felt it, a presence, watching from the darkness. I swung the flashlight towards the sensation, and there it was. The black dog stood a few yards away, its eyes reflecting the beam's light, giving them an otherworldly glow. My heart pounded in my chest, but I stood my ground, determined to understand this enigmatic creature. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, the dog turned and walked into the woods, its form melding seamlessly with the shadows. I didn't follow. Instead, I stood there, processing the encounter. In the days that followed, the sightings ceased. The black dog seemed to have vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. While I never uncovered the truth behind its presence, the experiences left an indelible mark on me. They served as a reminder of the mysteries that lurk just beyond the veil of the familiar, in the shadows of our everyday lives. I've spent a lot of nights alone in the woods. I used to love it, the feeling of complete separation from the rest of the world, just me and the trees, the stars, and the sounds of the wild. But every so often, something happens that reminds you just how small you are out there, how vulnerable. Back in 2010, I took a solo bike camping trip through the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington. My plan was to ride from Portland to Seattle, sticking to back roads as much as possible. I wanted to see the country at my own pace, to get deep into the forest and away from everything. The Baby Shoe Pass route seemed perfect for that, remote, rugged, and beautiful. It was the kind of place where you could go an entire day without seeing another person. I had no real schedule, no fixed plan. I carried what I needed on my bike: food, water, a sleeping bag, and a bivy sack. No tent, just the basics. I figured I'd find a random Jeep trail each night, ride a mile or two in, and set up camp wherever it felt right. That had worked well enough before. The day I ran into the bear, I had been riding hard. The forest roads were rough, steep in places, and completely empty. It was perfect. No cars, no distractions, just the quiet crunch of my tires on gravel and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. By late afternoon, I was near Big Tire Junction, looking for a place to set up for the night. I found an old Jeep trail that looked promising, just a narrow, overgrown track disappearing into the trees. I figured I'd follow it for a bit and see if there was a clearing where I could camp. About 100 yards in, I saw it. A black bear, maybe 150 feet ahead of me, standing in the middle of the trail. It wasn't huge, but it was close. Too close. It lifted its head, sniffing the air, then locked eyes with me. I froze. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I reached down and rang my bike bell like a lunatic, over and over. The bear hesitated, then turned and bolted into the trees. I stood there for a while, heart pounding, listening to it crash through the underbrush. Then I turned around and pedaled out the way I came. I needed to find a different place to camp. It took another hour before I found a new spot. Another Jeep trail, but this one seemed better. Less overgrown, less chance of running into anything big. I followed it about a mile and until I found a small, flat clearing. There was a fallen tree that made a good windbreak, and enough space to set up my bivy sack without worrying about rocks or roots. It was about 4,200 feet up, and the mosquitoes were relentless. I hadn't brought a tent, so I crawled into my sleeping bag around 8:30 p.m., hoping that being wrapped up would keep them off me. For a little while, everything was fine. The air was cooling down, and the only sounds were the usual forest noises. Wind through the trees, the occasional distant owl. I started to relax. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, I heard something. An engine. It started as a faint hum, way off in the distance. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But no, it was getting louder. An actual vehicle, out here in the middle of nowhere. I peeked out of my bivy sack, just as a truck came into view, slowly rolling down the trail toward me. It wasn't moving fast. It was just creeping along, like the driver was looking for something. Or someone. As it passed, the headlights briefly lit up my campsite. I saw the driver's face for one split second, and in that moment, we locked eyes. He saw me. Then the truck kept going, disappearing down the trail. I just lay there, heart hammering, trying to process what had just happened. This trail ended a mile or two down in the canyon. There was nothing out there, no roads, no cabins, nothing but miles of dense forest. Why the hell was this guy here? And now, he knew I was here too. I lay completely still, listening. For a while, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, maybe 30 minutes later, I heard the engine again. Getting closer. The truck was coming back up the trail. I stayed perfectly still as it passed, watching through the tiny opening in my bivy sack. The driver didn't stop, didn't slow down, just kept going. But I knew he had seen me again. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time a branch snapped or the wind rustled the trees, I was wide awake. I wasn't just thinking about the bear anymore. I was thinking about the guy in the truck. The next day, I packed up early and rode fast. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that spot. By evening, I had made it to Taklock Lake, another isolated area, but a little closer to civilization. I found an abandoned campground, one the Forest Service had closed off with a massive dirt berm to keep vehicles out. I figured I'd be alone. I was wrong. Sometime after dark, a group of yahoos showed up. They must have driven their trucks in anyway, ignoring the berm. I heard engines, loud voices, laughter, and then gunfire. They were shooting into the woods, drunk and reckless, completely unaware that I was there. I hunkered down, staying completely silent. I had no way to know what kind of people they were, but I wasn't about to take any chances. I barely slept. At 5 a.m., before the sun was even up, I packed up and slipped out of there as quietly as I could. I got back on my bike and rode out, not stopping until I was miles away. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I made it to Seattle without any more incidents. But even now, more than a decade later, I still think about that trip. The bear? That was normal, part of the risk of being in the wild. But the guy in the truck, that was something else. I have no idea what he was doing out there. Maybe he was just hunting, or scouting for firewood, or checking an old trail. Maybe he was completely harmless. But maybe he wasn't. And that night, for a few long hours in the dark, it was just the two of us out there in the middle of nowhere. Me and him. Camping alone in Sequoia National Park was supposed to be a peaceful escape. I had been on the road for a few weeks, moving from one wilderness area to the next, sleeping in the bed of my truck under the open sky. There was something about sleeping outside that made me feel more grounded. No walls, no artificial sounds, just the wind through the trees and the quiet presence of the night. That evening, after a long day of hiking, I parked at a designated campground, but chose not to set up a tent. Instead, I laid out my sleeping bag in the back of my truck, using my jacket as a pillow. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. The sky was clear, the kind of clarity you only get in the mountains, where the stars are endless and bright. Before calling it a night, I decided to climb onto a nearby boulder to get a better view of the sky. The rock was massive, worn smooth by time, with a cool surface beneath my hands. As I hoisted myself up, I noticed something unusual: shallow depressions in the stone, small circular bowls carved into its surface. They were weathered but distinct, clustered together in a pattern that suggested purpose. Nearby, thin grooves cut through the rock, almost like sharpening marks. I had seen similar formations before, usually at historical sites where Native American tribes once lived. These were likely mortar holes, used for grinding acorns or grains, and the grooves were probably for sharpening tools or weapons. It was strange to find them up here, away from any marked trails. The realization that people had once gathered on this same boulder, hundreds or maybe even thousands of years ago, gave me a strange feeling. It wasn't fear, just a quiet awareness that this place had a history far older than I could grasp. I stayed on the rock for a while, staring up at the sky. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness, a pale river of light. A faint breeze rustled through the trees, and in the distance, an owl called. Eventually, my eyelids grew heavy, and I climbed back down, making my way to my truck. I settled into my sleeping bag, adjusting my position a few times to get comfortable. The night air was cool but not cold, just the right temperature to let me burrow into the warmth of my bag. I exhaled slowly, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. I don't remember falling asleep, only that I was tired and content, with nothing to worry about except the long drive home in the morning. Then something changed. I thought I had woken up, but everything was wrong. I wasn't in my truck anymore. I wasn't near the campground either. I was lying in the middle of the forest, my sleeping bag beneath me on the bare ground. The trees around me were different, older, taller, their trunks twisting high into the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something heavy and metallic, like blood. I tried to sit up, but the moment I moved, I saw them. To my left, the ground writhed. A shifting, slithering mass of black eel-like creatures pulsed in the darkness. They moved together, hundreds of them, gliding in a thick, undulating stream across the forest floor. Their bodies gleamed in the faint light, smooth and wet-looking, like living shadows. They made no sound, no hissing or rattling, just the whisper of scales dragging over dead leaves and dirt. I could barely breathe. My body felt frozen, trapped in the strange stillness of a dream. But this didn't feel like any dream I'd ever had. It was too real, the weight of my body against the ground, the damp chill in the air, the scent of rotting leaves, and something deeper, something worse. Then, from the mass of writhing things, something familiar emerged. A rattlesnake. Its thick, coiled body slithered out from the dark tide, its patterned scales catching the dim light. It moved with purpose, its head rising slightly as it turned toward me. The rattles on its tail remained silent. It wasn't warning me. It didn't need to. It struck. I jerked back as its fangs sank into my sleeping bag, just inches from my ribs. The bite didn't pierce my skin, but I felt the pressure, the sharp jab of something trying to get through. Instinct took over, and I kicked, thrashing against the bag. The rattlesnake recoiled, vanishing back into the shifting river of black bodies. I gasped, chest heaving. The forest was still silent. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches reaching into the void above. But the stream of creatures kept moving, flowing past me, ignoring me now. They had a destination. I turned my head to follow their path. That's when I saw it. A massive black horse lay on its side, just a few feet away. Its stomach had been slit open, a gaping wound that exposed slick, dark insides. The stream of writhing things disappeared into the wound, slipping one by one into the open cavity of the dead horse. My head had been resting against its body. The horror of it struck me all at once, a deep, primal terror that made my skin crawl and my heart hammer, so hard I thought it would burst. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I threw myself away from the horse, scrambling backward on hands and knees, tangling in my sleeping bag. My fingers sank into the cold earth as I clawed for distance, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. And then, I was awake. For real this time. I was standing outside my truck, my heart pounding so violently that my vision blurred. My sleeping bag was still in the truck bed, untouched. The night was still and silent, just as it had been before I closed my eyes. The stars were above me, the trees unmoving. I had jumped out of my truck in my sleep. I stood there for a long time, my breath uneven, my hands trembling. The dream had been too vivid, too real. My skin still prickled with the sensation of lying against that dead horse, the weight of its body pressing into mine. My ears still rang with the silence of that forest, a silence so complete it felt unnatural. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, staring out at the darkened trees, my pulse gradually slowing. I've had nightmares before, vivid ones, but nothing like that. Nothing so real, so visceral. I don't believe in spirits or curses or any of that. But something about that place, about those carvings in the rock, something made me dream that dream. I don't know if it was just my subconscious, weaving together fragments of history and unease, or if it was something deeper. All I know is that I've never had a dream like that again, and I've never slept in Sequoia National Park since. I remember that weekend vividly. My husband and I had been looking forward to a camping trip with our friend, Mark, and a group of his friends. We had planned to stay at a campground in a remote part of West Virginia, seeking an escape from our hectic lives. Mark had driven all the way from Washington, D.C., eager to reconnect with nature and enjoy some quality time. Upon arriving at the campground, we were met with disappointment. The site was full, a result of our poor planning. Not wanting to let this setback ruin our trip, we decided to search for an alternative spot. After driving around for a while, we stumbled upon an area that appeared to have been a parking lot long ago. It was secluded, surrounded by dense woods, and seemed perfect for setting up our tents. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around a campfire, sharing stories and laughter. The crackling of the firewood and the chorus of crickets created a soothing ambience. Around midnight, feeling the weight of the day's journey, my husband and I decided to retire to our tent. The cool night air and the distant hoot of an owl lulled us into a deep sleep. Sometime around 1 a.m., we were abruptly awakened by the sound of vehicles approaching. Groggy and disoriented, we listened as the engines grew louder, eventually coming to a stop near our campsite. Peering out of our tent, we saw a group of men stumbling out of their trucks, clearly intoxicated. Their loud chatter and unsteady movements immediately set us on edge. The men approached our group, expressing a desire to join us. Despite the late hour, they were insistent, their voices slurred and their demeanor intrusive. Mark, trying to maintain a polite stance, informed them that we were all preparing to sleep and that it wasn't a good time for company. However, the men became pushy, repeatedly insisting on joining our group. The tension was palpable, and an uneasy silence settled over us. Suddenly, their tone shifted. They began questioning us about how we had found this spot, how long we had been there, and whether we had ventured deep into the woods. Their probing questions felt invasive, and a sense of dread washed over me. We answered cautiously, emphasizing that we had just arrived and hadn't explored much. After a tense pause, the men exchanged glances and abruptly decided it was time for them to leave. Before departing, they offered to sell us some party favors, which we declined. They lingered for a moment, their eyes scanning our group, before finally getting into their trucks and driving away. The relief was immediate, but the unease lingered. We spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened alertness, every rustle in the bushes causing our hearts to race. As dawn broke, we quickly packed up our belongings, eager to leave the unsettling experience behind. The encounter left me convinced that those men were involved in illicit activities in the woods, and that our presence had inadvertently encroached upon their territory. While we may never know their true intentions, the incident served as a stark reminder of the potential dangers lurking in secluded areas. We had been talking about this trip for months, planning it down to the last bottle of whiskey and the last gram of weed. The idea was simple: drive up the east coast of Australia, camp in national parks, and get absolutely obliterated every single night. It was the kind of trip that only made sense in your 20s, when you could wake up in a pile of dirt with a pounding skull and still laugh about it over a morning beer. We packed everything: swags, tents, camping chairs, enough food to keep us alive, and what could only be described as a liquor store's worth of booze. We had slabs of beer, bottles of rum and whiskey, cartons of cask wine, and enough weed to tranquilize a small farm. Just for good measure, we also brought a generous handful of dried magic mushroom caps. None of us had any idea what we were doing, but that was part of the fun. I wasn't driving. That was my only responsibility, to not drive. So, naturally, before we even left the state border, I downed 8 of the mushroom caps, washing them down with a swig of cheap whiskey. It was an impulsive decision, but I figured why not. The others laughed, knowing full well what was about to happen to me. It took a while to hit. We were hours into the drive when I started noticing it. The way the trees on the side of the highway seemed to bend and sway, even though there was no wind. The way the sky looked impossibly deep, like I could fall into it if I wasn't careful. By the time we reached the national park and started setting up camp, I was completely useless. The sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the trees. The others were busy unpacking the tents and getting the fire started, while I wandered around in a daze, giggling at nothing, watching the colors shift and swirl in the dimming light. Everything seemed impossibly beautiful. The forest was alive, breathing, watching. I was aware, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I was being unhelpful, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Then came the drinking. Bottles were cracked open, joints were rolled, and soon the air was thick with smoke and laughter. We grilled whatever we had: sausages, burgers, a questionable-looking steak that someone had brought in an esky. The fire crackled and spat embers into the night as we passed around a bottle of whiskey, each of us sinking deeper into the kind of drunk that makes the world feel soft and blurry. At some point, well past midnight, I realized I needed to take a shit. Not a casual, maybe later kind of shit. A now or never, full-scale emergency. The kind of shit that made my stomach clench and my vision tunnel. The problem was, none of us had bothered to look for a toilet before it got dark. In the excitement of setting up camp, getting wasted, and stuffing our faces, it simply hadn't come up. I voiced my concerns to the group, but they were too busy laughing at something else to care. So I did what had to be done. I grabbed a roll of toilet paper, strapped on my headlamp, and for reasons that even I couldn't explain, clenched a massive hunting knife between my teeth like I was some kind of deranged pirate. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I also wasn't about to take any chances. I wandered into the darkness, stepping carefully over roots and rocks, heading toward the river we had seen earlier. It wasn't far, maybe 100 meters from the campsite, but in my current state, it felt like a journey into the abyss. The forest was silent. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves as some unseen creature scurried through the undergrowth. My headlamp cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating tree trunks and twisted branches that seemed to shift and twitch in the dim light. Every so often, the beam would catch something reflective, spider eyes most likely, or maybe just wet leaves. But in my state, they might as well have been the glowing eyes of some unseen predator. Finally, I reached the riverbank. I found a relatively flat spot, dropped my pants, and squatted, still gripping the knife between my teeth. The headlamp cast wild shadows as I moved, making the trees around me seem like they were closing in. Then I saw them. At first, I thought it was just the mushrooms still working their magic. Shapes moving in the darkness, slow and shuffling, emerging from the bush on the other side of the river. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them, twisted, rotting figures, their skin peeling away in strips, their empty eye sockets fixed on me as they stumbled closer. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was mid-shit, frozen in place, my brain caught between fight and flight with absolutely no good options. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I gripped the toilet paper in one hand and the knife in the other, staring in horror as the figures moved closer, their jagged limbs shifting and twisting in the light of my headlamp. I blinked. They were gone. I swung the light around frantically, my heart pounding. The bushes rustled. Shapes flickered in the corner of my vision, disappearing as soon as I turned to look. I was shaking, hyperventilating, still not entirely sure if I was hallucinating or if something was actually there. I wiped, yanked up my pants, and bolted. I ran full tilt back to camp, nearly tripping over roots and rocks, crashing through the undergrowth like a lunatic. When I finally stumbled back into the firelight, panting and wide-eyed, the others barely even noticed. They were too busy drinking and laughing, oblivious to the absolute terror I had just experienced. I sat down, grabbed a drink, and told myself to calm down. It was just the mushrooms, just my brain playing tricks on me. The rest of the night passed in a blur of smoke and whiskey, my fears slowly fading into the background as the warmth of the fire and the laughter of my friends drowned out the lingering unease. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had been hit by a truck. My head throbbed, my mouth was dry, and my stomach was still doing somersaults from the combination of booze, drugs, and pure, unfiltered terror. I crawled out of my tent, rubbing my eyes, and staggered toward the nearest tree to take a piss. That's when I saw it. Not 20 meters from our campsite, barely hidden behind a line of trees, stood a public toilet block. I stared at it in stunned silence, my brain struggling to process what I was looking at. It was clean, well-maintained, had actual running water. I could have had a nice, peaceful shit in the comfort of a real toilet. Instead, I had squatted in the dirt, armed to the teeth, hallucinating zombies while fearing for my life. I started laughing. I laughed so hard I had to lean against a tree to keep from falling over. I laughed until my sides hurt, until tears streamed down my face. My friends, still emerging groggily from their tents, looked at me like I had lost my mind. And maybe I had. But one thing was for sure. Never in my life had I taken a more terrifying shit. And I probably never would again. I still remember the way the air felt that evening. The thick, dry heat pressing against my skin, the wind carrying the scent of burning pine and scorched earth. It had been weeks since the fire started, creeping through the national forests like a living thing, devouring everything in its path. At first, it was something distant, something happening to other people in other places. But by late July, it wasn't distant anymore. It was on the mountain behind my house. I had just gotten off work, drained and sticky from the heat. My dad had gotten home too, and the first thing I said to him was that we should start packing to evacuate. We had been told to stay alert, to have things ready, but I knew my family. We weren't the kind of people to get ahead of things until it was absolutely necessary. And then we saw it. The mountain was burning. It was still high up, but the flames were massive, tearing through the trees like a slow-moving explosion. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and dark, blotting out the sun in patches. The sight of it, the sheer size, the weight of it moving toward us, it made something click in my head. This wasn't just something happening. It was happening to us. I went straight for the legal documents. Birth certificates, medical records, anything that we couldn't replace. It took me half an hour to dig everything out, my hands shaking as I tried to keep my breathing steady. I didn't want to panic. Not yet. My youngest sister, only 8 at the time, was a wreck. She kept breaking down, hyperventilating, unable to make decisions. I helped her pack, tried to comfort her, but it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, telling a crying child that she couldn't take all of her stuffed animals. She wanted to bring only those, nothing else. No clothes, no necessities, just the things that comforted her. I had to talk her down, help her pick a few. She finally settled on an elephant she'd gotten from an ambulance ride when she was 4. I packed for her as much as I could while she sat on the floor, hugging her knees. My other sister was strangely calm. She packed a small bag, and that was it. No hesitation, no questions, just acceptance. I didn't know whether to admire her for it or feel disturbed. When I went to help my parents, they waved me off, told me to go pack my own things. I grabbed what I could, expensive things, sentimental things. My purse collection, my artwork. Then the heat got to me. It was summer, and I was on the top floor of the house, moving frantically. My chest felt tight. I could feel myself overheating, my head spinning, my limbs sluggish. A full breakdown hit me before I even realized what was happening. By the time I could pull myself together, the fire was halfway down the mountain. Animal supplies were next. We had 12 hens, 2 guinea pigs, and 2 dogs. Their food, their bedding, their carriers, it all had to be packed. I grabbed the guinea pigs, put them in their transport cage, and set them by the door. My dad had gotten a trailer from his boss, but I wasn't allowed to help load it. The smoke, the air quality, it would have been too dangerous for my asthma. By nightfall, everything was out of the house and ready to go. But we didn't leave. The fire had reached the base of the mountain on one side. I asked my parents again if we could leave, but they still said no. Not yet. I sat by the front door with my sisters. None of us really spoke. We just watched. The fire was mesmerizing. The way it moved, the way it twisted and curled into the sky. It was terrible, horrifying, but in some eerie way beautiful. Orange flames licking at the blackened trees, the purple-gray smoke billowing under the moonlight. It looked unreal, like something from a painting. I couldn't stop staring. By midnight, I had read myself to sleep. Every time I woke up, I checked the fire. It was still burning, but the flames were getting lower. By 6 a.m., the 1,000-foot flames were gone. I woke everyone up. My voice came out hoarse, my body heavy from exhaustion, but I didn't care. The fire was still there, still smoldering, but it wasn't the unstoppable monster it had been the night before. There was a fire line. The firefighters had saved us. People cried, some out of relief, some out of pure exhaustion. In the days that followed, we learned just how close we had come to losing everything. One house was destroyed. Several government buildings burned. Over 35,000 acres of forest were gone. A bucket helicopter had crashed during the night before our evacuation preparations. By some miracle, nobody had died. Well, no humans, at least. The fire had claimed more than just trees. We lost animals. Not just the wildlife, but animals we had known, loved. Thunder, my bird, was gone. A horrible accident. Rex, our fox at the sanctuary, had died of heat stroke and a heart attack from the stress of it all. We mourned them. And then there was Lady. She had been gone before the fire, but somehow, in the aftermath, it hit harder. Maybe it was because we had come so close to losing everything, so close to losing everyone, and I had been so painfully aware of how helpless we all were in the face of it. In the end, we were lucky. The fire could have taken our home, our animals, our lives. It could have erased everything, but we made it. The house sat on a quiet street, just far enough from town that the nights felt darker, the silence more complete. It was a nice place, 2 stories, a wraparound porch, a big backyard with a line of trees marking the edge of the property. I'd been here plenty of times before, hanging out with my best friend, watching movies, eating dinner with her family. It always felt warm and lived in, the kind of house where the kitchen smelled like whatever was baking, where the floors creaked a little in a comforting way. It was the kind of place you didn't mind spending time in. So when they asked me to house sit for a few days while they went out of town, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't anything complicated. Just feed the dog, bring in the mail, make sure everything was locked up at night. A favor for a friend, no big deal. The first night was fine. The house was quiet without them, but that was expected. Their dog, a big old mutt, was happy enough with just me around. I fed him, let him out into the backyard, and then settled onto the couch with a movie. It was summer in North Carolina, which meant it was hot even after the sun went down, the air thick and heavy. I kept the ceiling fan running in the living room, but even then, the heat clung to everything. I slept on the couch that night instead of upstairs. It just made sense. I wasn't staying long, and the couch was comfortable enough. The house creaked and settled, but nothing unusual. The dog slept at the foot of the couch, breathing slow and steady. I dozed off eventually, listening to the hum of the fan. The next day was just as uneventful. I did what I needed to do, let the dog out, grabbed the mail, checked that all the doors were locked. By midday, the house was stuffy, so I turned up the AC a little, though I knew it wouldn't help much. The afternoon sun beat down, turning the driveway into something like a stovetop. The air barely moved, hanging like a thick blanket over everything. That was when I decided to do some laundry. It wasn't much, just some clothes I'd worn the past couple of days, and I figured I might as well do something while I had time. The laundry room was near the back of the house, tucked next to the kitchen, and I loaded up the washing machine, set it to run, and headed upstairs to grab something to read. The moment my foot hit the first step, I felt it. It wasn't like the usual difference in temperature when you go upstairs in a house. Normally, the heat gathers, making the second floor stuffy, harder to breathe in. But this was the opposite. It was cold, unnaturally so. The kind of cold that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I stopped for a second, one foot still on the step, and listened. Nothing. Just the house, the hum of the washing machine running in the background. I told myself it was probably just the AC kicking in stronger than I expected, maybe a draft from somewhere. I kept going, one step after another, forcing myself to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. At the top of the stairs, it was worse. The cold was almost biting. the kind that made me want to rub my arms, even though I was still dressed for the summer heat. I hesitated, looking down the hallway. All the doors were open, just like they'd been when I arrived. It wasn't unusual. This family never kept doors closed when they weren't home. I wasn't even sure why it unsettled me. I grabbed the magazine from my friend's bedroom and turned back for the stairs. Something in me said not to linger. I walked a little faster than usual, not running, not letting myself look like an idiot over nothing, but moving with purpose. The whole time, my skin prickled like I was being watched. Back downstairs, the heat hit me again, thick and heavy, the way it should have been. I settled onto the couch, trying to shake the feeling, flipping through the magazine without really reading it. I told myself I was being stupid. The house was empty except for me and the dog, and I'd been here countless times before. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the floor upstairs. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. The dog lifted his head from where he lay beside the couch, ears twitching. He didn't bark, didn't growl, but his body tensed. The footsteps continued, crossing the length of the hallway. Then they stopped. For a moment, everything was dead silent. And then they started again, this time moving toward the stairs. I was up and moving before I even realized it, my whole body filled with the kind of panic that doesn't let you think. My only thought was getting out. My shoes were by the front door, but I didn't stop to put them on. I grabbed my keys from the counter and yanked the door open, stepping onto the porch just as fast as my legs would carry me. The dog followed, nearly knocking into me as he bolted outside. I turned, half expecting to see something at the top of the stairs, but there was nothing. Just the open doorway leading up to the second floor, the dim hallway beyond. I didn't go back inside. Not for my shoes. Not for the laundry sitting in the washing machine. Not even to lock the door. I sat in my car, the dog panting in the seat next to me, and I watched the house from behind the windshield. My hands were shaking. My heart was still hammering in my chest, the adrenaline making me lightheaded. Nothing moved inside. No shadows in the windows. No sound carrying through the open door. Eventually, I started the car. I drove to my own house, dog and all, and didn't look back. I made up some excuse later about why I had to leave early. Said something about feeling sick, about how the heat got to me. My best friend's family never questioned it. They came home a few days later, and life went on. They never asked about the laundry, and I never set foot in that house again. Hunting had been a part of my life for as long as I could remember. My dad wasn't just an avid hunter, he was a guide. Half my life had been spent following him through the thick, rugged terrain of New Mexico, learning the ways of the land. The mountains weren't just a place we went, they were practically a second home. I knew the smell of pine when the sun warmed the needles, the way the earth felt damp underfoot in the early morning, the distant bugle of elk echoing through valleys. But all the familiarity in the world didn't stop fear from creeping in when the mountains decided to remind us just how wild they really were. It was early November, cold enough at night for breath to fog, but not so cold that snow had buried the ground yet. We were deep in southern New Mexico, miles away from anything resembling civilization, set up in a small clearing tucked between thick clusters of ponderosa pines and junipers. The trees stretched tall, their trunks twisting like they had grown with the wind. Shadows pooled around their bases, disappearing into the undergrowth beyond the reach of our fire. The first night started off just like any other. We had spent the day hiking through steep, uneven terrain, following fresh elk sign, our boots crunching over dry leaves and brittle twigs. The scent of pine and dirt clung to us by the time we made it back to camp, our legs sore, our stomachs empty. My dad had set up a small, crackling fire, the orange glow flickering against our tents and gear. Dinner that night was mountain spaghetti. Something about eating outside, under a sky littered with stars, made everything taste better. The steam curled into the cold air, the fire popping now and then, and off in the distance, we could hear the faint sounds of the baseball game my dad had playing on the radio. It felt peaceful, safe. Then the sound came. It started low, barely noticeable over the crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the radio. A deep, mournful wail, long and drawn out. I paused mid-bite, my fork hovering over my plate, the hair on my arms lifting. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind, some odd gust moving through the trees in a way that made it sound almost human. But then it happened again. This time, it was louder. The pitch changed as it carried through the trees, bouncing strangely, almost like it was moving. My cousin and I froze, our eyes meeting across the fire. He was 12, just a couple of years older than me. But in that moment, we were both just kids sitting in the dark, listening to something neither of us could explain. Another wail. It was closer now. Each time, there was a brief pause, a stretch of silence that made the next call even worse. My stomach felt tight, my brain trying to work through the possibilities. I wanted it to be something I could name. A coyote, maybe. Or an elk, though I had never heard one sound like that before. My dad didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, still listening. Then, without a word, he reached over and grabbed his rifle. That was enough for us. We bolted for the truck, slamming the doors shut, our breaths quick and shallow. My dad just gave us a look, standing by the fire with his rifle resting easy in his hands, and told us, if he didn't come back, to lock the doors. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The wailing continued, shifting in tone, dragging out through the trees. Every time it stopped, the silence felt heavier. The fire flickered in the distance, throwing moving shadows against the tents, and my cousin and I sat stiff in the truck, trying not to breathe too loud. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the wailing stopped. Minutes passed. Then more. The night stretched long and quiet. Eventually, my dad came back, rifle slung over his shoulder, shaking his head with a grin. We weren't being hunted by some mountain creature. There was no ghost in the trees. It was just a group of wild horses, moving through their usual path, probably upset that we were in the way. I felt my face burn with embarrassment, but the fear from before still clung to my ribs. Knowing something was harmless didn't erase the fact that, for a few minutes, I had believed we were going to die out there. That wasn't the only time the mountains got the best of me. Another time, my dad and I were moving through the woods, picking our way through a particularly thick patch of trees. The air was cool, the smell of damp earth strong, and everything was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds in the canopy above. We were walking carefully, not talking, stepping over fallen logs and weaving around bushes when out of nowhere, the silence exploded. A sound like a helicopter, loud, fast, a blur of motion, erupted from the ground near my feet. My heart nearly shot out of my chest. For a split second, I thought I was being attacked, some huge animal launching itself out of the undergrowth. My body locked up, instincts screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then, just as quickly, the sound faded. I blinked, heart pounding, trying to process what just happened. A grouse. A stupid bird. It had been sitting quietly under a tree, completely invisible, and we must have startled it. When it took off, its wings had beat so fast it sounded like a goddamn rotor blade right next to us. I felt ridiculous. Again, but that was the thing about the mountains. No matter how well you knew them, how many nights you spent under the stars, how many miles you hiked through their vast, empty spaces, they could still catch you off guard. That night in the truck, listening to the wails in the dark, and the moment in the woods with the grouse, that was the mountains reminding me that I was small, that I didn't know everything, that out there, where the trees stretched high and the world felt endless, fear could take root in an instant. And sometimes, even when you knew better, it didn't let go right away. Camping in Grand Teton National Park was supposed to be a peaceful escape. My friends and I had planned this trip for months, eager to get away from everything, work, stress, the constant pull of phone screens and city noise. We wanted real quiet, the kind you can only get when you're miles from civilization, surrounded by trees, stars, and the heavy stillness of the wild. Coulter Bay Campground, sitting right up against Jackson Lake, seemed perfect. We arrived late in the afternoon, setting up camp in one of the more isolated spots toward the back of the campground. It was exactly what we were looking for, no immediate neighbors, no distractions. Just us, our tents, and the vast stretch of forest that made up the Tetons. We had 2 tents, one for me and another buddy, and a smaller one for our third friend, set up just a few feet away. We were surrounded by towering pines, their trunks thick, their branches casting long, uneven shadows in the fading sunlight. By the time we had our fire going, the temperature had dropped significantly. Even in summer, the Tetons had a way of chilling you to the bone at night. We sat close to the flames, eating our simple dinner, dehydrated meals, some trail mix, and a few beers we had packed in a small cooler. The air smelled of pine and smoke, the night sky above us impossibly clear. No streetlights, no headlights, just the dim glow of the moon reflecting off Jackson, lake somewhere beyond the trees. The quiet was deep. Not like the silence you get in a house with the TV off. This was different. This was the kind of quiet where your ears almost ring from the absence of background noise. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of the wind through the trees felt amplified. The occasional call of an owl or the distant splash of something moving in the water were the only reminders that we weren't completely alone out here. We stayed up talking until about 1 in the morning. By then, the fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, and the exhaustion of the long day had finally settled in. We put away anything that might attract animals, tied up our food in a bear bag, secured our trash in the metal bin provided by the park. Then we crawled into our tents, zipped up our sleeping bags, and let the cold mountain air settle in around us. I was just drifting off when I heard it. A scream. Not human. Not anything I could immediately place. It started low, a guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, then stretched into a high-pitched, piercing wail. It was violent, filled with something primal and raw, like something was dying, or killing. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing off trunks and branches, making it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. My heart slammed against my ribs, my entire body going rigid. I held my breath, listening. Another scream, this one even more brutal than the first. It sounded feline, but I wasn't sure. A mountain lion, maybe? It didn't sound like a bear. I'd heard bears before, deep, resonant roars or low huffing sounds, the kind that make your skin crawl but don't sound quite like this. This was different, sharper, more unsettling. I barely breathed. I knew my friends were awake too. The sound was too loud, too unnatural for them to have slept through it. I whispered, so low I barely heard myself. "You heard that, right?" A beat of silence. Then, from the other tent, yup. And then from the smaller tent, another quiet confirmation. None of us said anything else. What could we say? The sound continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. A shriek, then a lower, choked-off noise, then another shriek, fading into the distance. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I wanted to grab the hatchet lying beside me, but moving felt like a risk. I didn't want to make a sound. Not yet. My heart was hammering, my body locked in place. I stared at the nylon ceiling of the tent, ears straining for any sign of movement. Nothing. Eventually, my breathing slowed, my muscles unclenched. Whatever it wasn't right outside our tent. It hadn't come for us. It was just out there. Somewhere. Hunting, maybe. Or dying. I didn't know. And I didn't want to. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to close my eyes. Ignored the way my stomach twisted at the thought of what might be lurking beyond the thin walls of my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. We didn't talk about it when we woke up. Not at first. We packed up our gear, made breakfast over the fire, oatmeal and instant coffee, neither of which tasted like anything. The night before lingered in my head, that sound looping over and over again, but I didn't say anything. Neither did they. It was only when we were hiking later that day that one of them finally broke the silence. "You think it was a cougar?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe." But the truth was, I wasn't sure. I had never heard anything like that before, and I hadn't wanted to look outside to find out. The next few nights, we stayed at the same campsite. We didn't have much of a choice. Moving would have been a hassle, and besides, whatever had happened that night hadn't happened again. No more screams, no more eerie silences. Just the usual sounds of the woods, the wind in the trees, the distant howl of coyotes, the occasional hoot of an owl. But every time I lay down to sleep, I found myself listening, straining my ears for even the faintest sign of something moving in the dark. I kept the hatchet close. The bear spray, too. I knew they probably wouldn't do much against a cougar, but it was better than nothing. By the time we packed up and left the campground, I was relieved. Not just because I was ready for a hot shower and a real bed, but because I didn't want to spend another night waiting for that scream to come back. I still don't know what we heard. Maybe it really was just a cougar. Maybe it was something else. But I do know that whatever it wasn't something I ever want to hear again. I woke up early that morning, the Hawaiian sun just beginning to cast its golden hues over the horizon. The gentle rustling of palm leaves and the distant calls of seabirds created a serene symphony that beckoned me to the ocean. I had always been drawn to the sea, its vastness offering both adventure and tranquility. Today was no different. I planned to spend my day exploring the pristine waters of the national seashore. After a hearty breakfast at a local cafe, where the aroma of freshly brewed Kona coffee mingled with the scent of tropical fruits, I overheard a snippet on the radio about a tsunami watch. An earthquake had occurred somewhere in the South Pacific. The announcer's tone was casual, almost dismissive, and no alarms had sounded. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the frequent seismic activity in the region. Besides, the ocean looked as inviting as ever under the clear blue sky. With my snorkeling gear in tow, I made my way to the beach. The sand was warm beneath my feet, and the gentle waves lapped at the shore, whispering secrets of the deep. I waded into the water, the cool embrace of the ocean sending a pleasant shiver up my spine. The underwater world was alive with color and movement. Schools of vibrant fish darted among the coral reefs, and the sunlight danced on the sandy seabed. Time seemed to stand still as I floated, weightless, immersed in the beauty around me. The rhythmic sound of my breathing through the snorkel was almost meditative. I ventured further from the shore, chasing the allure of deeper waters and the promise of more marine wonders. It was then that I noticed a subtle change. The water around me felt different, more turbulent, as if stirred by an unseen force. I tried to plant my feet on the seabed, but they met only open water. A pang of unease shot through me. I was sure I hadn't drifted that far out. Instinctively, I swam a few strong strokes toward the shore. To my surprise, I found myself in shallow water almost immediately, the sudden shift disorienting. The ocean's behavior was odd. There hadn't been the usual pull of a receding wave or the powerful push of an incoming one. Just a strange, almost eerie turbulence. A rule I'd always adhered to echoed in my mind. When the ocean behaves unpredictably, it's best to get out. I hurriedly made my way to the beach, the wet sand squelching under my feet. As I looked around, I noticed that the line of wet sand had moved significantly inland, by about 20 to 30 feet. Puzzled, I glanced back at the ocean, which now seemed calm, as if nothing had happened. Dismissing it as a freak wave, or perhaps an undercurrent, I gathered my belongings and left the beach. The rest of the day was uneventful, filled with the usual island activities, sampling local cuisine, browsing through quaint shops, and watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. 2 days later, as I sipped my morning coffee and flipped through the newspaper, a headline caught my eye. Tsunami hits Hawaiian shores, minimal damage reported. My heart skipped a beat as I read on. The article detailed how a tsunami, triggered by the South Pacific earthquake, had reached Hawaii. The waves had caused the water levels to rise by 1 to 2 feet in some areas, leading to unusual oceanic behavior. A chill ran down my spine as realization dawned. The strange turbulence, the sudden depth changes, the shifted shoreline, it all aligned with the tsunami's timeline. I had been in the water during a tsunami and hadn't even known it. Reflecting on the experience, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. The ocean, in all its beauty, holds immense power, a force that commands respect and humility. That day, I had unknowingly danced on the edge of danger, cradled in the arms of the sea's unpredictable nature. The incident became a personal testament to the delicate balance between human curiosity and nature's might. It reminded me that while we seek adventure and connection with the natural world, we must remain ever vigilant and respectful of the forces beyond our control. I had always been drawn to the wild, seeking solace and adventure in the embrace of nature. The dense forests, towering mountains, and winding trails called to me, offering an escape from the monotony of daily life. Over the years, I had numerous encounters with wildlife, each leaving an indelible mark on my memory. One crisp autumn morning, I set out on a solo hike along a familiar trail in the heart of the Rockies. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I had traversed this path many times before, but nature has a way of reminding you that familiarity does not equate to predictability. As I rounded a blind corner, I suddenly found myself face to face with a massive grizzly bear, no more than 25 feet away. Time seemed to stand still as we locked eyes. The bear, an imposing female with 2 cubs resembling street bernards, glanced in my direction but showed no signs of aggression. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slowly backed away, giving her the space she deserved. Thankfully, she continued foraging, uninterested in my presence. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for the uneventful encounter. Another time, while navigating a different trail, I encountered a young male grizzly, perhaps weighing around 250 pounds. He was engrossed in digging for roots, paying me little mind as I cautiously skirted around him. These experiences taught me the importance of respecting wildlife and maintaining a safe distance, especially when the unexpected occurs. However, it wasn't the bears that instilled the deepest sense of caution in me. It was the moose. These colossal creatures, often underestimated, possess a formidable presence. Their sheer size, muscular build, and unpredictable temperament make them a force to be reckoned with. On one occasion, I stumbled upon a bull moose, its massive antlers resembling an intricate hat rack. The moose eyed me with what seemed like disdain, and I instinctively knew to keep my distance, recalling tales of their notorious aggression. My adventures weren't confined to the backcountry alone. During a visit to Glacier National Park, I parked my car at a scenic overlook, eager to stretch my legs and take in the breathtaking views. As I stepped out, I froze. A massive bighorn sheep ram stood mere yards away, its muscular frame and curled horns a testament to its strength. The ram's imposing presence was enough to send me retreating back into my vehicle, heart racing. I watched from the safety of my car as it sauntered by, unbothered by the brief intrusion. These encounters, while harrowing in the moment, deepened my respect for the wild and its inhabitants. They served as poignant reminders that in nature, we are mere visitors, and the creatures we encounter command both awe and caution. Each experience reinforced the importance of vigilance, respect, and humility when treading through their realm. The bus rumbled beneath me, a steady vibration that had become familiar over the past week. It was my first class in college, a geology field course that ran the 2 weeks before the semester started. The itinerary was packed. We were traveling from Illinois all the way through South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, stopping at the Badlands, the Black Hills, Devil's Tower, the Bighorn Mountains, and Yellowstone before looping back to school. It was an incredible opportunity. I was excited about the trip from the moment I signed up. We would be camping in places I had only seen in textbooks, studying rock formations in the field instead of a classroom. I was ready for long hikes, cold nights, and endless notebooks full of observations. But there was something about the trip that unsettled me. I don't know exactly when I started feeling it, but by the time we reached our second camp in the Black Hills, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The site was completely empty except for us. A forest of tall pines stretched around us in every direction. The ground was soft with needles, and the air smelled fresh, untouched. It should have been peaceful. It was peaceful, but the entire time I felt watched. Not just uneasy or on edge, but the distinct skin-prickling sensation that eyes were on me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I didn't know anyone in the class very well yet, and being away from home for the first time was probably messing with my head. But that didn't stop the feeling. I stuck close to the group. When I needed to go into the trees, whether to grab firewood or take a leak, I made sure never to go too far. Just a few steps in, and the silence felt different, heavier. I couldn't explain why, but I didn't like it. The others seemed fine. They wandered into the woods without hesitation, talking and laughing, their voices bouncing between the trees. No one else mentioned feeling uneasy. The worst part was at night. The fire burned down, and everyone crawled into their tents. I lay awake, staring at the fabric above me, listening to the rustling of pine needles outside. The air was perfectly still. No wind, no distant voices, no reason to feel like something was watching. But I felt it anyway. I turned onto my side, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me. My heart pounded in my ears. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Footsteps, the snap of a twig, something moving between the trees, but nothing ever came. The next morning, I woke up groggy, frustrated with myself. There was no reason to feel this way. It was just a normal forest. We packed up camp and drove west. By the time we reached Devil's Tower, I had mostly put the Black Hills behind me. The monument rose out of the ground like a massive pillar, streaked with long vertical cracks. I had seen photos of it before, but nothing prepared me for how strange it felt in person. The land around it was almost too quiet, as if the whole area existed in its own separate world. We walked the trails, taking notes on the igneous rock and its odd, column-like structure. Small pieces of cloth fluttered from tree branches, offerings left by local tribes. The tower was a sacred place to them, and even though it was a national monument now, it still held an energy that I couldn't shake. The feeling returned. It wasn't exactly the same as the Black Hills. There, I had felt watched from the woods, something lurking just out of sight. Here, the weight was different. It was less like something was watching me, and more like I shouldn't be there at all. Like I had stepped somewhere I didn't belong. The sun was bright, the sky clear, and I tried to focus on my notes. But my hands were clammy, my back tense. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing too close behind me. I was relieved when we left. I told myself it was just my imagination again, that I was tired, that I was reading too much into things. But as we moved deeper into Wyoming, the feeling didn't go away. We set up camp in the Bighorns, not far from where we'd be doing field work the next day. The terrain was different here, rockier, more open, but there were still patches of trees scattered around the site. By now, I was used to the routine. The bus stopped, we unloaded gear, we pitched tents. The others spread out, excited to explore, but I hesitated. The feeling was back. Not as strong as before, but it was there, needling at the back of my mind. My senses felt too sharp, like my body was on alert before my brain could figure out why. I stayed near camp. The others crashed through the underbrush, climbing over fallen logs, calling out to each other when they found something interesting. I sat on a rock and tried to distract myself. I wasn't scared, exactly. Just uneasy. Nothing happened that night. I slept a little better, though I still woke up feeling like I had spent the entire night waiting for something. The final time I felt it was in Yellowstone. We had spent the day climbing a mountain on the eastern edge of the park. The higher we went, the thinner the trees became, and by the time we reached the top, we had a clear view of the valley below. The descent was easier. Loose gravel crunched beneath my boots as I moved down the slope, following the others. The sun was getting lower, stretching shadows across the ground. I don't know how it happened, but at some point, I lost the group. I paused, looking around. I had only stopped for a moment to adjust my pack, and somehow, they had slipped ahead. The landscape was open enough that I should have been able to see them, but all I saw was the stretch of rock and sparse trees leading back down the mountain. I exhaled slowly, gripping my straps. That's when I felt it again, the sense that something was creeping up behind me. I turned fast, heart hammering. Nothing was there, but the feeling didn't go away. I started walking, faster this time. My boots scuffed against the loose dirt, my breath coming shorter. I didn't know why I was hurrying, only that something deep in my gut was telling me I should. The air felt wrong, too still. A sound, maybe a footstep, maybe just a rock shifting, echoed somewhere behind me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I focused on the path ahead. When I finally caught up with the group, the feeling faded, but it didn't leave completely. It stuck to me all the way down the mountain, through dinner, through the long bus ride back to school. I never told anyone about it. The trip was amazing, and I learned more than I ever expected. But every time I think back on it, I remember those moments just as clearly as the rock formations, the lectures, the breathtaking landscapes. The feeling of being watched, of not belonging, of something just out of sight. Not even 6 months ago, my husband, my 10-year-old bonus son, who had just turned 11, our dog, and I went on a road trip from Portland, Oregon, to the outskirts of Cougar, Washington, near Mount St. Helens. It wasn't anything planned out. We just wanted to get away for a bit, to drive with no real destination in mind, stopping wherever looked interesting. We took random turns, sometimes following roads that led to nothing, other times finding ourselves in areas that seemed promising for hiking. Eventually, we pulled up to a blocked-off road where only foot traffic was allowed to continue. It felt like a good place to explore. It wasn't an official trailhead, just a narrow, paved road leading up the mountain, but we parked at the bottom and decided to check it out. There were a few people coming down as we started walking up. They looked like they'd been hiking for a while, dressed in proper gear, heavy boots, trekking poles. We weren't exactly prepared for a long trek, but we had good shoes, water, and some snacks. As they passed us, they warned, "The higher you go, the more snow and ice you'll run into." They didn't seem alarmed, just letting us know. We thanked them, but the warning didn't change our plans. Looking at a map on my phone, I realized the path led up toward Climbers Bivouac, a well-known spot for those attempting to summit Mount St. Helens. That seemed like a reasonable turnaround point for us. 3 miles up, then 3 miles back. It would be a long hike, but not impossible. The air was cool and fresh, the sky clear, and the trail, for the most part, was easy to follow. The first 2/3 of the way up was manageable. Most of the snow was packed into shaded areas, patches here and there, nothing too concerning. Our dog ran ahead, excited to be out, sniffing everything, darting back and forth. My husband was relaxed, walking at a steady pace, while my son and I stayed a little behind, taking our time. We were having fun, joking around, stopping every so often to admire the view. But the last mile changed everything. The snow deepened, becoming harder to navigate. At first, it was just a few inches thick in spots, then a foot, then 2. Eventually, we were stepping through snowdrifts over 5 feet deep. There were soft patches where our legs sank in unexpectedly, making every step feel like a gamble. I'd put my foot down, thinking the snow was solid, only to suddenly drop knee-deep, struggling to pull myself out. It was slow going. By the time we reached Climbers Bivouac, we were exhausted, our legs burning from the effort. The view was incredible, though. The mountain loomed above us, white and vast, untouched in a way that made it feel almost surreal. We took a short break, eating some snacks, letting the dog roam around while we caught our breath. Then we turned back. Going down should have been easier. Gravity was on our side, and the path was familiar. But almost immediately, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The air was colder. The light had changed slightly, the way it does in late afternoon when the sun starts dipping behind the trees. But more than that, it was the silence. The deep, unnatural silence that settles in places where something is watching. Our dog, who had been running ahead and exploring all the way up, suddenly changed his behavior. He stuck close to us now, no longer darting off. He wasn't panicked, but he was alert, his ears twitching, his head turning more often. He stayed right at my husband's side, glancing back at my son and me, as if making sure we were still there. I noticed it, but I didn't say anything at first. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he'd caught a scent of something. But then we heard it. A heavy thud. Not a branch breaking. Not snow falling from a tree. Something big had moved behind us. Then came the sound. A deep guttural oh-wach, echoing through the trees. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't a bear. It was low, powerful, vibrating in a way that I felt in my chest. The closest thing I could compare it to was the warning calls gorillas make in documentaries, but this was different. Deeper, rougher, more deliberate. I froze. My son did too. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance back. The trees were thick, the undergrowth dense, but I knew exactly where the sound had come from. 20, maybe 25 feet behind us. Something was there. I looked at my husband. He kept walking, his posture unchanged, his stride even. If he had heard it, he didn't react. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't turn around. That was Spike. He gagged and gasped. I knew he was lying. I'd seen the dog the whole time. Spike hadn't made a sound. But I didn't argue. I just nodded and kept walking. Then we heard it again. Closer. The exact same sound, but this time no more than 10 feet to my right, deeper in the trees. I didn't turn my head. I didn't stop. But I did look at my dog. Spike's entire posture had changed. His ears were back, his body tense, his tail lowered. He wasn't growling, wasn't baring his teeth, but every part of him screamed one thing: danger. I gripped my son's hand without saying a word and quickened my pace. My husband did the same. None of us spoke. None of us acknowledged it. For the next mile, we didn't hear it again. But we weren't alone. The forest felt heavier, pressing in on us. Every few minutes, a branch snapped somewhere behind us. Always behind us. Not the sharp, random crack of something falling naturally, but the deliberate sound of something stepping where it shouldn't be stepping. I kept my eyes forward, listening to the crunch of our footsteps in the snow, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence again. But nothing did. 2 miles left. The deeper snow made it impossible to move quickly. We had to step carefully, avoiding the soft patches, staying on the firmer ground. Every now and then, my foot would sink, throwing me off balance, my heart slamming into my ribs as I struggled to pull myself out. And all the while, Spike stayed close. 1.5 miles left. The branches stopped breaking. The forest was too quiet. 1 mile left. The pressure in my chest eased just slightly. The air felt lighter. The silence, while still unnatural, didn't feel as oppressive. Half a mile left. And then, just like that, whatever had been there stopped following. It didn't run. It didn't retreat. It just wasn't there anymore. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. A quarter mile later, we reached the car. I opened the door, and Spike jumped in immediately. Not playful. Not excited. Just in. We got in too, shut the doors, locked them, and sat there in silence for a few moments, catching our breath. The forest in front of us was still. The trees didn't move. The air didn't stir. But I knew. I knew something had been there. And I knew we had been watched. I didn't say anything as my husband started the engine. I didn't say anything as we pulled away, heading back toward the main road. But as the trees blurred past us, disappearing behind us, I made myself a promise. I would never go unprepared again. I never believed in anything beyond what I could see, touch, and understand. I was raised in a house where superstition was something old people clung to, stories passed down just to keep kids in line. My family went to church on holidays, but no one ever spoke much about God or the devil in any real sense. They were just ideas, symbols, something distant. That all changed the night I was 16, at a sleepover with my friends. It was supposed to be a normal night, nothing out of the ordinary. There were 6 of us, all crammed into my friend Lisa's living room, sprawled across the carpet, laughing over dumb jokes and eating way too much junk food. Lisa's parents were in the next room, watching TV, the glow from the screen flickering against the hallway walls. Everything about that night was normal, until it wasn't. I don't remember who suggested it, but at some point, someone pulled a box out from under the couch. The cover had an old, faded design, but I didn't pay much attention to it. It looked like any other board game. I had never played before, and no one explained what it was. Not until they laid it out in front of us. I remember staring at the letters, the numbers, the words yes and no written in the corners. I laughed when I realized what it was. A Ouija board. I had heard about them before, mostly from dumb ghost stories, but I had never seen one in real life. Lisa was excited, saying we should try it. Everyone else seemed on board, giggling, daring each other to ask something spooky. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to be the only one refusing. I convinced myself it was just a game, a piece of cardboard and plastic. Nothing more. We all placed our fingers on the planchette, the small heart-shaped piece of plastic that was supposed to move around the board. At first, we just asked stupid questions. Will I get a boyfriend this year? Who has a crush on me? The planchette moved, but I was sure it was one of my friends pushing it. Then someone, I don't even remember who, asked, "Is there a spirit here?" The planchette slid to yes. I felt a chill, but I still didn't believe it. We kept asking questions, letting it move around the board, laughing when it gave nonsense answers. Then someone asked, "Show yourself." The moment the words were spoken, every single light in the house went out. Not just the ones in the living room, all of them. The hallway, the kitchen, even the TV in the next room. For one terrifying second, we sat there in complete, absolute darkness. Then, just as suddenly as they went out, the lights snapped back on. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence. A power surge, maybe. But my hands were shaking when I placed them back on the board. "Who are you?" someone asked. The planchette started to move in large, deliberate circles, faster and faster before stopping at the letter D. Then E. Then V. I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to pull my hands away, but I couldn't. My fingers felt frozen in place. I watched, my heart pounding, as it spelled out the word, DVIL. No one spoke. No one laughed. It wasn't funny anymore. Then, in the silence, someone whispered, "If you're really the devil, show yourself." For a few seconds, nothing happened. I started to breathe again, my mind grasping for any explanation that made sense. Then the TV shut off. I don't mean it lost signal. I mean it shut off completely, the screen going black so fast it left a faint afterimage in my vision. And in that reflection, in the darkened screen, I saw something. A shape, a figure, sitting on the couch just behind us. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Someone screamed. The air in the room turned ice cold, so cold I could see my breath. From the kitchen, there was a sudden violent crash, something falling, shattering against the floor. Then the cupboard slammed open and shut, the sound so loud it made my ears ring. I scrambled back, knocking the board over as I did. Lisa was crying. Someone else was screaming. Her parents burst into the room, demanding to know what was going on, but the moment they stepped in, they saw it too. The dark shape in the reflection of the TV. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly we were all running, flipping on every light in the house, throwing the board into the trash, shoving furniture against the walls like it could somehow protect us. No one slept that night. The house still felt cold. I told myself it was over, that it was just some freak accident, that the stress of the night had made me see things that weren't there. Then I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, my mind foggy with exhaustion. Then I heard it. A sound. Something heavy clanking, scraping. It was coming from the roof. I held my breath. Listened. Chains. The sound of metal dragging. Then, underneath that, something else. Breathing. Low, growling, wet breaths. And then the unmistakable sound of claws clicking against the shingles. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body frozen. I wanted to scream, to wake someone up, but I couldn't make a sound. The noises went on for what felt like hours, but eventually they faded. I told myself it had been a dream. The next morning, I went to the kitchen, my hands still shaking as I poured myself a glass of water. I asked Lisa's parents if any of their neighbors had dogs. They told me no. And then, after a long pause, they told me they had heard it too. That was the last time I ever touched a Ouija board. The last time I ever let myself get involved in something I didn't understand. I don't know what we invited into that house that night. I don't want to know. I just know that, even now, after all these years, I refuse to watch movies about possession. I refuse to talk about demons, because I know deep down, that night wasn't just a game. And I don't ever want to open that door again. I was around 11 or 12 when my parents decided to separate. The ensuing divorce meant selling our family home, and my mother and I relocated to a secluded farm a few miles away. This new place was tucked away on a dirt road called Mitchell Road, named after a long-deceased farmer who once owned the land. Mitchell Road was an obscure, winding path stretching about a mile uphill through dense New York forest. Halfway up, there was a serene pond, followed by a well-kept house with manicured bushes and a sprawling yard. Another half-mile ascent led to a large horse farm on the right, complete with a barn and a house. Directly opposite, on the left, stood our new residence, a restored barn attached to a sizable yellow farmhouse divided into two family units. Along the driveway, a large trailer sat to the right, just past the houses, near an old slaughterhouse where cows were once processed. Further along lived another family, and continuing down the road led to a half-mile-long driveway that disappeared into dense wilderness, ending at our landlord's secluded home. The area had an unsettling aura. My bedroom was upstairs, with a window overlooking the road leading to our house and the expansive fields below. In one of these fields stood a towering crucifix, about 25 feet tall, a sight that struck us as peculiar. However, in our region, such religious symbols weren't entirely uncommon due to the prevalence of devout communities. One night, roughly a week after moving in, I was jolted awake by a pulsating glow filling my bedroom. My initial thought was that the house was on fire, but the shadows of trees dancing on my walls indicated the light source was outside, behind the trees in our backyard. Curiosity piqued. I approached the window, and what I saw remains the most terrifying sight I've ever encountered. The massive cross was fully illuminated, casting a stark light over the surrounding area. Small fires burned around its base, and beyond these flames, I discerned figures moving about. Squinting to focus, I realized they were people on horseback, draped in black robes with pointed hoods. They rode within the firelight's reach, their movements deliberate and haunting. The sheer shock overwhelmed me, and I must have fainted, collapsing back onto my bed beneath the window. The following morning, my mother woke me for school. The vivid memory of the night's events flooded back. I rushed to the window to find the cross still standing, wisps of smoke rising from its structure. It appeared to be made of metal, possibly white or silver with blue trim. The fires had smoldered out, but the ground bore fresh horse tracks, and scattered around were empty liquor bottles. The entire scene was profoundly disturbing. I confided in my mother about what I'd witnessed. Her immediate reaction was to leave that place without delay. Concerned for my well-being, she arranged for me to attend therapy sessions for a few weeks. The experience was so traumatic that I seldom spoke of it, this being only the second time I've revisited those harrowing memories, the first being in therapy. Years later, a tragic incident occurred on Mitchell Road. A young couple, unfamiliar to the area, crashed their car around 5 a.m. Their bodies weren't discovered until a day later, and by then it was too late. Their families had no idea why they were on that desolate road, adding to the enigma surrounding the area. Eerie occurrences seemed woven into the fabric of that road's history. During my high school years, I spoke with the school nurse, an older woman residing in the well-kept house down the road. I mentioned the unsettling atmosphere of Mitchell Road, to which she responded, "Old man Mitchell was an occultist years ago. He had a large family with multiple wives and often performed sacrifices next to that cross during full moons." Her words sent a chill down my spine, leading me to believe that what I had witnessed that night was a continuation of those dark rituals. Reflecting on those events, I can't help but feel a lingering unease. The memories of Mitchell Road and the haunting imagery of that illuminated cross remain etched in my mind, a testament to the inexplicable and the shadows that lurk in forgotten corners. The air outside was thick and heavy, the kind of humidity that settled on your skin like an extra layer, making everything feel damp even if it wasn't. It had been an unbearably hot day, the sun baking the ground to the point where even stepping barefoot onto the dirt left a stinging impression. But now that the sun had gone down, the heat wasn't as sharp. It was just lingering, clinging to everything, trapped in the grass and the trees, waiting for the night to slowly drain it away. I had just taken a long shower, trying to cool off. The water pressure wasn't great at our place, but it didn't matter. It was the kind of shower that made you feel clean in a way the whole day hadn't, washing off the sweat and dust and leaving me fresh, even if I knew I'd be sweaty again the second I stepped outside. My hair was thick, heavy with water, and I gathered it all up into a massive bun without thinking much about it. I didn't have the patience to deal with it right then. It would air dry eventually. I was heading over to Rachel's place anyway. She wanted to practice doing hair, and mine gave her plenty to work with. I knew she wanted to be a hairstylist in the future. She'd already talked about it a million times. She had her whole plan mapped out, down to what kind of salon she wanted to work at. I wasn't great at doing my own hair, so it worked out. She needed the practice, and I didn't mind letting her experiment. It was something to do, and in a place like this, anything that kept the boredom away was a win. Rachel's house wasn't far, but it wasn't a short walk either. The road between our places wasn't really a road, more of a dirt path that had been there forever, cutting through the trees and stretching out into the open. There weren't any streetlights out here, no sidewalks, no markers. Just a worn-down trail, a single-track path surrounded by woods, fields, and endless night. I stepped out of the house, the air immediately wrapping around me like a damp blanket. The scent of warm earth, damp leaves, and the faintest hint of honeysuckle filled the air. The trees rustled softly in the distance, the kind of sound that never really stopped out here. Crickets chirped steadily, a low, rhythmic background noise that never let up. Every now and then, I could hear something larger moving through the brush, a rabbit, maybe a possum. The kind of sounds you got used to when you lived in the middle of nowhere. The ground was uneven, loose dirt shifting under my feet in some places, packed firm in others. The heat of the day still clung to it, and with every step, I could feel it radiating upward. I walked quickly, not because I was scared, but because it was habit. The faster I walked, the less time I had to think about what might be moving out there beyond what I could see. I reached Rachel's house in about 10 minutes, her porch light a dull yellow glow against the darkness. The house was quiet when I walked in, the way it always was. Her parents weren't the type to hover. They gave us our space, let us do whatever as long as we weren't being idiots about it. Rachel's room was upstairs, and I made my way up, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. Her room was bright, the vanity mirror taking up nearly half the wall. The lights around the mirror were the kind that belonged in an old Hollywood dressing room, long strips of bulbs running down the sides. They cast a warm glow, making the whole room feel warmer than it actually was. I sat down in front of it, reaching up to undo the bun I had thrown my hair into without a second thought. The second I pulled the elastic free, I felt it. A strange, unnatural movement. Something shifting, rustling, coming loose all at once. Before I could even process what was happening, they were everywhere. Moths, wasps, bees. At first, it didn't make sense. My mind struggled to catch up, to understand what I was looking at. A cloud of them, dark shapes against the bright lights, fluttering and darting in every direction. Some flew straight up toward the ceiling, others spiraled wildly, disoriented, wings beating against the warm glow of the bulbs. A few dropped down, hitting the vanity, the floor, the bed. I barely moved. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it was rattling my ribs, but my body didn't seem to know what to do. I just stared, watching them scatter, my brain still trying to piece it together. They had been in my hair. That realization hit hard, a wave of disgust and horror rolling through me all at once. The bun. I had twisted it up so tightly, and the heat, the moisture, it must have made the perfect place for them. And the shampoo, the scent, had probably drawn them in. A nest. I had made a nest. One of the wasps landed on my arm, its legs scraping against my skin. My body finally caught up, and I flinched hard, knocking it away before it could sting me. Another one was on my shoulder, its wings buzzing frantically as it tried to make sense of what was happening. The moths were worse in a way, lighter, more unpredictable, fluttering against my face, my neck, my arms. I felt them in my hair, trapped in the strands, trying to fight their way out. I scrambled to my feet, hands moving through my hair as fast as I could, shaking, pulling, swiping, trying to get them off me. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my stomach turning. The room was still full of them, flying wild, disoriented, moving toward the light, toward anything that made sense in their small, panicked world. I ran my fingers through my hair over and over, searching for anything still clinging to me. The feeling of them crawling, the weight of them, even though I knew they were gone. My skin crawled, the sensation of wings and legs lingering long after they had left me. It took a while for them to clear out, for the air to settle. Some found their way to the window, drawn by the night outside. Others still clung to the walls, the ceiling, the floor, wings fluttering weakly as they tried to figure out where to go next. I stood there, breath coming hard, heart still slamming against my ribs. My hands shook, fingers still tangled in my damp hair. Lesson learned. I had never thought about it before, never considered the idea that something as simple as wet hair in the night could become a trap, a home, an invitation. But I wouldn't forget it now. I would never tie up my hair like that again. Never walk through the night with a bundle of damp, sweet-smelling strands, making myself a walking shelter for anything that might be looking for one. Even hours later, after everything had settled, I could still feel them. The ghost of their wings, the scrape of their legs. I knew it would be a long time before I didn't. The air was dry, crisp with the scent of pine and earth, the kind of clean, untouched wildness that could only exist this deep into the backcountry. My legs ached from the day's hike, a steady, relentless push through the Bob Marshall wilderness. We were about 100 miles in, carrying everything we needed on our backs, moving at about 20 miles a day. It had been nearly 2 weeks since we had last seen another person. Just my girlfriend and me, swallowed up by the vastness of Montana. We had just crested a ridge, our boots crunching softly on loose dirt and scattered pine needles. Below us, a shallow ravine cut through the forest, lined with thick underbrush and clusters of fallen logs. Across that ravine, maybe 200 yards away, something moved. I stopped mid-step. At first, it didn't seem real. The shape was massive, blending into the earth tones of the wilderness. Then it moved again, rising up on thick, powerful legs. My stomach turned to ice. A grizzly. I knew they were out here. You didn't go this deep into the Bob without knowing it was their territory. Not just any grizzlies either. This was where they relocated the problem bears, the ones that had gotten too comfortable around people, the ones that had learned to associate humans with food. I'd read about them before we set out. Bears that had gotten into campsites, that had learned how to rip into coolers, that had lost their fear. Some had attacked people, and when they caused too much trouble in places like Yellowstone or Glacier, they were sent here. The bear lifted itself onto its hind legs, and I could see just how big it was. 10 feet, maybe more. Its fur was thick and rough, its muscles shifting beneath its coat as it sniffed the air. Even at this distance, I could see the massive hump of muscle above its shoulders, the power in its limbs. I didn't breathe. My body locked up, some deep, ancient instinct kicking in. My girlfriend had frozen too. I could feel her tension beside me, could hear the faint hitch in her breath. The bear stared. It didn't charge, didn't move closer, just stood there, studying us. Seconds stretched. I felt like prey. Slowly, the bear dropped back onto all fours, its massive paws pressing into the soft earth. It turned its head slightly, sniffed again, then, without hurry, began to move away, lumbering through the underbrush, disappearing between the trees. It wasn't running. It wasn't scared of us. It simply lost interest. It took me a long time to breathe again. Even after it was gone, I felt like it was still there, watching, somewhere, hidden between the trunks, behind the thick green of the pines. It was getting late. The light was shifting, the sun dropping lower in the sky, turning everything gold and amber. We had to find a place to set up camp. My stomach twisted at the thought of sleeping anywhere near here, but we didn't have much choice. Hiking out wasn't an option. Even if we pushed hard, it would take 5 days to get back to civilization. We moved carefully, our senses on high alert. Every snapped twig, every rustle of wind through the trees felt like the sound of something approaching. My skin prickled, my pulse pounding in my ears. We picked a spot near a cluster of trees, slightly elevated, with good visibility in all directions. I wanted to see anything that might come near us. Setting up camp felt wrong. The usual routine, pitching the tent, gathering wood, securing our food, felt like we were painting a target on ourselves. I kept looking over my shoulder, waiting to see that massive shape moving between the trees again. The fire crackled low as the night settled in. The wilderness around us came alive with sound, branches shifting in the wind, distant owl calls, the occasional snap of something unseen moving through the brush. We had always known there were risks out here. We had prepared. We had stored our food properly, had read about bear country safety. But none of that mattered now. Not really. We had seen it, and now it knew we were here. The thought was impossible to shake. We decided to take shifts sleeping. One of us would stay awake, keeping watch, listening, scanning the darkness for movement. I took the first shift. Sitting outside the tent, I clutched the only thing that made me feel slightly less helpless, a dull survival knife. It was useless. If that bear wanted to come back, if it decided we were worth the effort, I knew there was nothing I could do. I listened to my girlfriend's breathing from inside the tent, slow and uneven as she tried to sleep. I envied her for even attempting it. Time crawled. The fire had burned down to embers. The cold crept in, sharp against my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter, rubbed my hands together to keep the circulation going. Every so often, I turned my head, scanning the trees, watching the shadows shift and move. At some point, exhaustion won. I shook my girlfriend awake, whispered for her to take over, and climbed into the tent. My body was stiff with tension, but I forced my eyes shut, let the darkness take over. I must have slept for a couple of hours when I woke up to a sound. A low, distant thump. I held my breath. Another. Not footsteps. Not quite. More like something shifting, something heavy pressing into the earth. I turned my head slightly, listening. My girlfriend was frozen. I could feel her beside me, completely still. Then, a sound closer this time. A huff, like a sharp exhale through a massive set of nostrils. We weren't alone. A shape moved outside the tent. I could see the faintest suggestion of something massive in the dim moonlight, something stepping between the trees. The bear. It had come back. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs. My mouth was dry. I gripped my knife tighter, even though I knew it was useless. The bear was close. I could hear its breathing now, the slow, steady inhale and exhale, the kind of deep, powerful sound that belonged to something massive. I imagined it sniffing the air, its black nose testing for food, for movement, for anything that might interest it. We didn't move. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the breathing faded. The bear moved on, disappearing into the trees once more. Neither of us slept the rest of the night. Morning was the sweetest relief I had ever felt. The first hint of light filtering through the trees was enough to make my entire body loosen. We packed up in silence, moving with stiff, exhausted limbs. I still felt like I could sense it out there, somewhere, watching from the distance. The Bob Marshall Wilderness is a beautiful, brutal place. It gives and it takes. Out here, you are nothing. Just another animal. Another piece of the wild. That bear had decided, for whatever reason, that we weren't worth the trouble. We hiked on, moving away from that place, away from the memory of that long, endless night. But I never forgot. I was 13 this summer. I stayed with my grandparents in their house at the end of a quiet street. The house itself wasn't creepy, not in the way old abandoned houses looked in movies. It wasn't falling apart or covered in vines or buried under dust. It was just a house. But my grandparents had a way of always moving into places where strange things happened. They never seemed to notice. Maybe they didn't care, or maybe they had just gotten used to it. I didn't believe in ghosts. At least not then. It was a good summer, the way summers were when you were a kid. I had no school, no responsibilities, just video games and junk food, and nights spent staying up as late as I wanted. My bedroom was at the very end of the hallway, across from my grandparents' room. It was a long hallway with thick, soft carpet that swallowed sound. The bathroom was at the halfway point, and at the very end, across from my room, was the cupboard where my grandpa kept his Tums. He had stomach problems, or maybe just a habit, but he always got up in the middle of the night for them. I could hear it every time. I'd be lying in bed, controller in hand, and I'd hear the dull thud of footsteps pressing into the carpet. He'd walk past my door, pause at the cupboard, open it, then make his way back to his room, finishing off the routine with the quiet click of his bedroom door closing. It happened enough that I barely noticed it after a while. It was just part of the background noise of the house, something expected, something normal, until it wasn't. The first time I noticed something off, I didn't think much of it. I heard the footsteps, same as always, but they came later than usual. It was past 1 in the morning, which was strange because my grandpa usually got up earlier than that. I waited, expecting to hear the cupboard open, the shuffle of him taking out the bottle. But it didn't come. I listened as the footsteps made their way back down the hall, stopping near my door. Then silence. That was the first time I opened the door to check. Nothing. The hallway was dark, the only light spilling in from my room behind me. I squinted down the hall, waiting for my eyes to adjust, expecting to see the shape of my grandpa just barely slipping into his room. Nothing. Just darkness and silence. I hesitated for a second longer, then shut my door and went back to my bed. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I hadn't heard the footsteps at all. Maybe I had mistaken some other noise for them. Maybe my grandpa had just moved quicker than usual, gotten back into bed before I had a chance to see him. I had 1,000 explanations, and I picked the one that made the most sense. But it kept happening. Some nights, I would hear the footsteps and open the door as quickly as I could, hoping to catch him in the act. But there was never anyone there. The hallway would be empty, the air thick and still, the dark pressing in like a wall. I got used to it. It became background noise, like before. I stopped checking, and then one night, something changed. I was in bed, the glow of the TV flickering across the walls, my controller still warm in my hands. I wasn't even paying attention to the screen anymore, just mindlessly clicking through menus. Half asleep, but not ready to turn in just yet. The footsteps started. I barely noticed at first. They made their way down the hallway, slow and steady, following the usual path. I didn't even look up. They stopped at the cupboard. I waited. Then they started again, heading back toward my room. I was still staring at the screen when I heard the doorknob. It wasn't a quiet click. It wasn't a slow turn like someone testing the lock. It was a rapid, frantic, clacking sound, like someone was twisting it back and forth as fast as they could. Every hair on my body stood on end. My chest went tight, my hands frozen where they rested on my blanket. I turned my head slowly, staring at the door like I could somehow see through it. The knob rattled again. Not just a small shake. This was violent, desperate. It sounded like whoever was on the other side wasn't just trying to open the door. They were trying to rip it off the hinges. I moved without thinking. I jumped out of bed, my legs shaky beneath me. My breath caught somewhere in my throat. My hand shot out and grabbed the knob, gripping it tight, holding it still. Everything stopped. No resistance. No pull. Silence. I waited, my heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway was dead quiet. I didn't want to open the door. Every part of me screamed not to. But I had to. I twisted the knob and yanked the door open, fast, expecting something. There was nothing. The hallway was dark. Still. The carpet stretched out in both directions, undisturbed. I stepped forward, hesitating at the threshold, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned my head toward my grandparents' room, my feet moving before I could think about it. I reached out, pushed their door open an inch. Snoring. My grandpa was inside, asleep. I let the door fall shut. I stood there for a long time, just listening, just breathing. The house didn't make a sound. I went back to my room. I shut the door. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I didn't say anything. I didn't ask my grandpa if he had gotten up in the night. I didn't tell my grandma what had happened. I just sat at the table, eating my cereal, staring down at the bowl like it held all the answers. Nothing happened for a while after that. The footsteps stopped. Or maybe I just stopped hearing them. Maybe I had learned to tune them out again, the way I had before. Summer ended. I went home. I didn't think about it much after that. It was years later, when I was older, that I brought it up to my mom. I don't know why I thought of it, but I did. I told her the story, expecting her to laugh, to tell me it was just my imagination, to say I had been dreaming or that I was scaring myself over nothing. But she didn't. She just listened, her face still, her expression unreadable. And then, after a long pause, she said, "Yeah, that house always felt weird." I waited for her to say more, but she didn't. She just left it at that. And I never asked again. Camping was always something my family took seriously. We didn't do the normal, cramped campgrounds with neatly arranged fire pits and RV hookups. My parents had a rule: if you could hear another group talking, you weren't really camping. That's why every summer, we found our own spots deep in the woods, tucked away from trails, roads, and people. One of our favorite places was a national park a few hours from home. We'd been camping there for years, always driving down old, forgotten logging roads, pushing farther each time, looking for the perfect secluded site. It was a tradition, something we did without question. When I was 13, we found what we thought was the best spot yet. A narrow, overgrown logging road led us in, twisting through the thick trees before opening into a small clearing between two large ponds. The land was shaped like a saddle, a gentle hill rising between the still, dark waters. It was perfect, far enough from any main road that we wouldn't see another soul for days. And with the ponds so close, we had fresh water and the steady chorus of frogs to fall asleep to. That first evening, we did everything like we always did. We hauled our gear from where we had to stop the car, dragging coolers and bags of supplies through the weeds and over fallen branches. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, thick with summer humidity. The sun was dipping low when we finished setting up. The tents were pitched, the fire was going, and dinner was sizzling in an old cast iron pan. The ponds were alive with noise. It was a sound that became background music, something you didn't notice until it was gone. Frogs, crickets, the occasional splash of a fish. I remember sitting by the fire that night, listening to the way the sounds all blended together, rising and falling in waves. The world felt distant, like we had stepped into a separate, untouched place. Then, at around 2 in the morning, that peace was shattered. The first thing I noticed was the rumble. A deep, low vibration that started far off and grew louder with each second. It wasn't thunder. It was an engine, no, multiple engines, big ones. Headlights cut through the trees as 2 massive black trucks came barreling down the overgrown road, bouncing over ruts and pushing through the undergrowth like it was nothing. They didn't slow down as they neared our camp. They roared in like they belonged there. We scrambled out of our tents, half awake and confused. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see them pull up only 20 yards away. The doors swung open all at once. Men poured out, a ridiculous number of them. At least a dozen crammed into each truck, like they'd been stacked on top of each other. They didn't say a word. They didn't even acknowledge us. No one turned their heads. No one muttered a quick sorry for disturbing us. It was like we weren't even there. They moved in eerie silence, each one carrying a net. Without hesitation, they waded straight into the ponds. It was the strangest thing I had ever seen. These weren't guys out having fun. There was no laughter, no joking, no conversation at all. Just the quiet splash of water as they skimmed the surface, dragging their nets through the reeds. They worked fast. The frogs that had filled the night with their calls were suddenly in chaos, their croaking turning frantic. Every time a net swept through the water, dozens of them disappeared. For over an hour, we stood there, frozen, watching them. They never looked at us, never gave any sign that they knew or cared, that we were standing just feet away. Then, just as suddenly as they came, they finished. They hauled their nets full of wriggling, kicking bodies back to the trucks, tossing them in without ceremony. The frogs barely made a sound. One by one, the men climbed back in. The doors slammed shut. The trucks backed up, turned around, and thundered off into the woods, leaving behind deep tire tracks and absolute silence. The ponds were dead. The chorus of frogs was gone. We stood there for a long time, listening to the nothingness. It felt wrong, like the land had been stripped of something important. Eventually, exhaustion won. We crawled back into our tents, but sleep never really came. The night felt too still. The next morning, the silence was worse. It wasn't just the ponds. The whole area felt muted, as if the forest itself had recoiled from what had happened. While packing up, we found one survivor. A single frog, lying in the mud with one leg twisted unnaturally. We placed him gently back in the water. He floated there for a moment, then kicked weakly and disappeared beneath the surface. But the pond remained silent. We never camped at that spot again. The following summer, we went back to the same national park, but in a different area. It was another deep woods spot, far from any official campgrounds, surrounded by thick trees and quiet streams. The first night passed without incident. The second night, though, something else happened. It was early morning, still dark, when I woke to a strange sound. A soft, dragging noise. Something heavy moving across the ground. I sat up and squinted into the dim light. Near the tree line, a large shadow moved. For a second, I thought it was a person, but then it stepped into the faint glow of the moon, and I saw the shape of its head. A black bear. It wasn't paying attention to us. Instead, it was focused on something else, something clamped in its jaws. It took me a second to register what I was seeing. Our cooler. One of us had left it open. An entire pack of marshmallows had been inside, sitting on top of the beer cans. The bear had helped itself. It carried the cooler with shocking ease, dragging it through the dirt like it weighed nothing. The lid hung open, swinging back and forth. For a few long minutes, we watched in frozen silence. The bear didn't seem interested in anything else. It lumbered toward the trees, still holding the cooler. Then, just before disappearing into the woods, it stopped. It lowered its head, sniffed the ground, and of all things sighed. A long, heavy exhale, almost human-like. Then it vanished. At first light, we went searching. We found the cooler about 30 yards away, wedged against a fallen log. The marshmallows were gone. The beer cans were dented, crushed by massive jaws. A few had been punctured, leaking foamy liquid into the dirt. We laughed about it later, calling it the Great Marshmallow Heist. It felt like a funny memory, something harmless to tell friends about. But I never forgot the ponds. I never forgot the way the men moved, how they never spoke, how they stole the frogs like silent, efficient machines. I never forgot how the water stayed quiet, even after we left. And I never stopped wondering, who were they? And where did they take all those frogs? When I was about 8 or 9, my family lived in a house at the end of a cul-de-sac in a small, hidden neighborhood. It wasn't a fancy place, just a simple, one-story home with a big backyard. The backyard was huge, almost too big for a place in a suburban neighborhood. It had thick grass that grew fast in the summer, a few scattered trees, and an old wooden fence that separated it from the houses behind us. But there was one part of the yard none of us ever went near. The far corner where a rusted-out flatbed trailer sat, half buried in weeds. That part of the yard always made us uneasy. Even our dog, a scrappy little mutt named Duke, avoided it. He was the type of dog that barked at everything, from passing cars to kids on bikes, but he never went near that trailer. If we threw a ball in that direction, he would run after it, stop short, and come trotting back like he'd lost interest. If we tried to call him over there, he would hesitate, ears flat, tail low, and eventually turn away. The feeling was mutual. My sisters and I never played near it. Even when we were running around, chasing each other in the grass, we unconsciously stayed away from that corner. It wasn't like we had a specific reason. There was just something about it that felt wrong, like stepping too close would make your stomach tighten and your skin crawl. Inside the house, things weren't much better. My 2 younger sisters shared a room, but sometimes they would sneak into mine at night, dragging their blankets and pillows along with them. When I asked why, they would say they didn't like their room because of the lights. There's weird lights in there, one of them had whispered once. I didn't understand what they meant, and my parents brushed it off. They figured it was just streetlights shining through the curtains or headlights from passing cars reflecting in the windows. My sisters were little, so I guess my parents thought they were just being scared of the dark. But it happened enough times that I started wondering if there was something more to it. Then one night, something happened that I've never been able to explain. I woke up suddenly, but not because of a noise. It was a feeling. A heavy, suffocating anger filled the room, like when you're standing next to someone who is furious at you, barely holding back their rage. I wasn't scared at first. I was confused. My heart was beating too fast, and my whole body felt tense, like something was wrong, but I didn't know what. Then I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway. A dark shape, just standing there, unmoving. It wasn't the usual kind of shadow you see when your eyes are adjusting to the dark. This was solid, blocking out the faint glow from the hallway behind it. I couldn't see any details, just the outline of a person. And then there was the light. A single red glow, hovering in the darkness. It was the size of a cigarette ember, like someone taking a slow drag, the way my parents did when they smoked. That's what I thought it was at first, one of them standing in my doorway. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. "Mom," I whispered. "Dad." No answer. I blinked. The red light was gone. So was the figure. My stomach dropped. My breath caught in my throat, and for a few seconds I couldn't move. The room was suddenly freezing, the kind of cold that sinks into your skin and makes your muscles lock up. My hands trembled as I grabbed the blanket and yanked it over my head, curling into a tight ball beneath it. I stayed like that, barely breathing, ears straining for any sound. Then, at the foot of the bed, I felt it. A tug. It was small at first, barely noticeable, like someone was lightly pulling at the edge of my blanket. My heart slammed against my ribs. Another tug, stronger this time. I clenched my hands around the fabric, gripping it so tightly that my knuckles ached. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The tugging stopped, but the fear didn't. I stayed frozen, my body curled tight, my breath short and shallow. At some point, I must have fallen asleep again, but it was the kind of sleep that didn't feel real. More like slipping into a haze, drifting in and out of consciousness, never fully resting. The next morning, I went straight to my parents and told them what had happened. I expected them to be concerned, to at least check the house, but they just gave me tired, skeptical looks. "We were asleep the whole night," my dad said. "You just had a nightmare," my mom added. I wanted to argue, to insist that I knew what I saw, what I felt. But I didn't. I could tell they wouldn't believe me. So I let it go. But I never forgot. Years passed, and we moved out of that house. I thought I would forget about it, that the memories would fade over time. But they didn't. If anything, they got worse. I started having nightmares. Not just about the house, but about the neighborhood. The worst ones were always about the den, the garage-turned-living space at the back of the house. In my dreams, it was different. Instead of being on the same level as the rest of the house, it had stairs leading down like a basement. And at the bottom of those stairs was a black hole. Not literally, a dark space, a void, a place where I knew something was waiting. I never saw what it was. I never had to. I just knew. If I got too close, if I went down the stairs, I wouldn't come back. I had other dreams, too. In them, the entire neighborhood was wrong. The houses were dangerous. If I tried to go to one for help, I would die. That was the feeling in the dream. Not a fear of dying, but the certainty of it. Like the entire area was poisoned, infected with something that stretched beyond just our house. It wasn't until years later, talking to my younger sister, that I realized I wasn't the only one. We were reminiscing about the house, laughing about silly childhood memories, when the conversation shifted. I mentioned the nightmares, the black hole in the den, the way the house never felt quite right. She went quiet. Then slowly she said, "I had those dreams too." She described almost the exact same things. The den, the fear, the neighborhood feeling wrong. But in her dreams, she would run down the stairs into the kitchen, where the cupboards would be opening and closing by themselves. And standing in the den, near where I always saw the black hole, there was a man. Neither of us had ever talked about it before. We had lived in that house as kids, slept under the same roof, walked the same rooms, yet somehow, both of us had been carrying the same nightmares for years without realizing it. When we told our mom, we expected her to dismiss it. But instead, she went pale. "I had dreams about that house too," she admitted. And just like that, everything clicked. It wasn't just childhood imagination. It wasn't just a bad dream. It was something real, something that had settled into that house, into that neighborhood, leaving behind an unease that none of us could shake, even decades later. I've driven past the house a few times since then. From the outside, it looks normal. But every time I turn onto that street, I feel it. That tightness in my chest. That wrongness. I don't know what it was. I don't think I ever will. But some places don't let go. And that house, that neighborhood, it's one of them. There are some things you don't forget, no matter how long ago they happened. Some things stay with you, creeping back into your mind when you least expect them. I don't think about that day all the time, but when I do, I remember every little thing. The smell of damp leaves, the way the morning sun filtered through the trees, the sound of distant birds, and the bones. I was 8 or 9 years old when it happened. My dad liked to take me hiking, nothing serious, just small trails in state parks near our house. It was something we did together, a way to get outside and spend time away from everything else. I always liked those hikes. They felt like little adventures, even if we were never that far from home. That morning was cool and crisp, the way fall mornings are when summer still lingers in the air, but the leaves are already starting to turn. We got up early, packed some water and snacks in a small backpack, and drove to the park. It wasn't a big place, just a few trails winding through the woods, but it was nice, peaceful. The start of the hike was uneventful. The woods were quiet except for the occasional chatter of squirrels and the rustling of birds in the trees. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, mostly yellow and brown, with a few patches of red here and there. I remember kicking them as I walked, watching them scatter in front of me. Dad led the way, his boots crunching on the gravel path, while I trailed behind, stopping now and then to look at rocks or tree stumps. About an hour in, we decided to take a break. There was a small clearing just off the trail, a nice spot with a fallen log that made for a decent bench. Dad took off his backpack and pulled out a bottle of water, offering it to me. I wasn't thirsty yet, so I shook my head and wandered a little ways away, just to look around. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a strange-looking pile of leaves, a little mound off to the side of the clearing. Something about it looked off, though. The way the leaves were sitting, almost too neatly, like they'd been placed there instead of just falling naturally. And there was something else, something white glinting from underneath. Curious, I stepped closer. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe a piece of trash, maybe an old plastic bag caught in the dirt. But when I nudged the leaves aside with the toe of my shoe, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Bones. Small ones. I froze. For a second, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. The bones were scattered but mostly intact, half buried under the damp leaves. The skull was turned slightly to the side, empty eye sockets staring at nothing. It wasn't big, not like an animal's. It was small. Human. A kid. I don't remember making a sound, but I must have because the next thing I knew, Dad was beside me, looking down at the same thing I was. His face went pale, his jaw clenched tight. And then we were moving. We left everything, water bottles, snacks, even Dad's backpack, right there in the clearing. I didn't look back. We just walked fast, not quite running but close. The path blurred under my feet, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. By the time we got back to the car, I was shaking. Dad unlocked the doors with shaky hands, and we got inside. Neither of us spoke. He started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, driving faster than he normally would. We went straight to the nearest ranger station. Dad told them what we found, his voice tight and clipped. They took it seriously. A couple of officers showed up, asked Dad to take them back to the spot. I stayed in the car, staring out the window, trying to make sense of it. It didn't feel real. After a while, Dad came back. He didn't say much, just got in and started the car. We drove home in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bones. I saw the skull, the way it was half buried in the dirt. I kept thinking about how long it had been there, how long that kid had been missing before someone finally found them. Dad tried to follow up with the police a few times, but we never learned much. Just that the skeleton was human. I don't know who they were. I don't know if they ever figured it out, if someone was waiting for answers, hoping for closure. I like to think they did. I like to think that after all those years, that kid got their name back, that their family finally knew what happened. I hope they did, because no one deserves to be forgotten. I was young when it happened, too young to understand why my mom's face went so pale that night or why her voice shook when she picked up the phone. I only knew that her ghost stories would never be the same after that. We lived in a small apartment complex that my mom managed. It wasn't a fancy place, just a standard building with thin walls and creaky floors, the kind of place where you could hear your upstairs neighbors' every move. My mom had been there for years, working long hours, making sure everything ran smoothly, handling complaints, fixing minor problems when the maintenance guys weren't around. The night before Halloween, she gathered us around and told us a story. It was supposed to be fun, a little scary, something to set the mood for the holiday. She told us that years ago, two little boys and their mother had lived in the apartment right above ours. One night, there was a fire. The smoke alarms didn't go off in time. By the time the firefighters arrived, it was too late. The mother and her sons had died in their sleep. Ever since, she said, people had claimed to hear footsteps running up and down the hallway late at night. Tiny, quick footsteps, like little boys playing. She smiled as she finished the story, waiting for our reaction, probably expecting nervous giggles or fake bravery. But before we could say a word, we all heard it. The unmistakable sound of running. Right above us. The apartment that was supposed to be empty. For a second, I thought it was a joke. Maybe my mom had planned this, had someone upstairs making noise to scare us. But the look on her face told me otherwise. She went stiff, her eyes wide, mouth slightly open. The color drained from her cheeks. My mom didn't scare easily. She dealt with angry tenants, break-ins, even a guy who tried to refuse eviction by barricading himself inside his unit. But this scared her. She grabbed the phone and called the security guard who patrolled the complex, along with one of the maintenance guys who was still on site. My siblings and I stood in the living room, listening to the heavy, slow footsteps pacing upstairs now. No more running, just slow, deliberate steps, as if someone knew we were listening. When the security guard and maintenance guy arrived, my mom unlocked the door to the apartment, and they all stepped inside. I held my breath. The hallway light flickered above us. A minute passed, then another. Finally, the security guard stepped back out, shaking his head. "There's someone living up here," he said. A homeless woman and her two children had slipped in through a broken window and had been living in the empty unit for who knew how long. She wasn't violent, wasn't trying to scare anyone, just a mother trying to keep her kids safe. I remember feeling strange about it, like the ghost story had suddenly become something real, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't spirits of dead children haunting the hallways. It was real children, scared and hiding in the dark. My mom never told another ghost story after that. Years later, we moved to a different complex, one my mom also managed. It was bigger than the last place, but not much better. There were always issues, broken locks, complaints about loud neighbors, the occasional break-in. My mom had a routine, checking vacant apartments before showing them to new tenants, making sure everything was in order. Normally, she had maintenance guys with her, but that day she was alone. I went with her. We went through a few units, checking faucets, flipping light switches, making notes of what needed repairs. Most of the apartments looked the same, empty, silent, stale air that smelled of fresh paint or leftover dust from old carpets. Then we reached one where the door wasn't locked. It just opened. I figured some kids had messed with it. The complex wasn't in the best area, and we'd had problems before with people breaking into empty units. It wasn't surprising. I stood near the window, looking outside, watching the parking lot below while my mom checked the bedrooms. Then she screamed. It wasn't just a startled yelp. It was a full-on, heart-dropping scream. I ran. She was in the master bedroom, standing just outside the closet. I followed her gaze and froze. Inside the closet was a girl. Pale, almost bluish, half naked, her skin covered in bruises. She was crouched in the corner, her nails dug so deep into the drywall that they had carved scratches into it. I didn't understand at first. My brain couldn't process what I was looking at. Then my mom snapped at me. "Get help." I turned and ran. I was halfway down the hallway when I heard something behind me. Heavy footsteps. I turned my head just enough to see a man, tall, broad-shouldered, at least 6 feet 3 inches, bolting out of the kitchen. The kitchen where I had been standing just moments before. He had been in there the whole time. I didn't think. I just ran after him. We hit the stairwell. He was fast, clearing steps 2 at a time. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I kept going. He reached the bottom floor, cut through the parking lot. I chased him for maybe 400, 500 feet before I lost him. He disappeared between 2 buildings, gone before I could even think about where he might be headed. By the time I got back to the apartment, security had arrived. The girl was being helped out of the closet, wrapped in a blanket. She wouldn't talk. She just stared, her body still curled in on itself. I don't know where she came from, who she was, how she ended up there. I only know what we walked in on. She had been in the middle of being assaulted when we opened that door. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't shown up. What haunted me the most wasn't just the girl. It wasn't even the man. It was the fact that I had been standing in that apartment, in that kitchen, completely unaware that he had been hiding just a few feet away from me the entire time. After that day, I never walked into an empty room the same way again. In the early 1980s, my father was deeply involved with a woman I'll refer to as Jane. Their relationship was intense, and Jane's affection for my father was profound. Her mother shared this sentiment, both women envisioning a future where Jane and my father would build a life together. However, circumstances led them apart, and my father eventually met and married my mother. This separation was a blow to both Jane and her mother, a wound that seemed to fester over the years. Jane's coping mechanisms were far from healthy. She frequently indulged in various substances, which seemed to amplify her erratic behavior. Not long after my parents' wedding, during their first year renting a modest mobile home, they began noticing unsettling changes. Items in the kitchen and bathroom would be mysteriously rearranged. Initially, they dismissed these occurrences, attributing them to forgetfulness or perhaps even playful pranks by friends. But the frequency and subtlety of these disturbances grew, casting a shadow of unease over their home. A few years later, having moved to a different residence in hopes of starting anew, the eerie intrusions resumed. This time, the signs were more blatant. My mother returned home one evening to find a tube of red lipstick wedged between the couch cushions, a brand she never used. On the kitchen counter sat a cold can of Dr. Pepper, conspicuously out of place in a household loyal to Mountain Dew. These weren't mere coincidences, they were deliberate acts, messages meant to unsettle. The realization that Jane was behind these invasions was chilling. If she had the audacity to breach their sanctuary, it was plausible she was also lurking nearby, observing their routines, waiting for moments when the house was vacant. The silent phone calls began soon after, persistent rings that, when answered, were met with nothing but oppressive silence before the click of disconnection. My father, stoic and protective, seldom spoke of these incidents, but the tension was palpable. One winter, during a bustling Christmas shopping trip to the local Walmart, I was 9 years old. Amidst the festive chaos, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. An older woman seemed to shadow us, appearing in every aisle we visited. Her presence was unsettling, her gaze lingering a moment too long. That evening, our home phone rang. My father answered, and from the fragments of the conversation I overheard, it was clear the caller was distressed. Jane's mother had been following us, tormented by the belief that my brother and I were the grandchildren she was meant to have. Her sobs echoed through the receiver, a haunting reminder of the obsession that gripped both mother and daughter. The following summer, my brother and I were playing in our backyard. A woman, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, approached with a clipboard in hand. She greeted us warmly and proceeded to inspect the power meter attached to our house. Her demeanor was professional, and nothing seemed amiss. My mother, always vigilant, noticed the unfamiliar figure and stepped outside to inquire. The woman responded politely, but offered no specific identification before departing. 3 days later, a man from the power company arrived to read the meter. Puzzled, my mother mentioned the earlier visit from the woman. The technician's expression shifted to concern as he explained that no female employees were assigned to such tasks, and no readings had been scheduled for that week. The horrifying possibility dawned upon us. Jane, or perhaps someone she had enlisted, had been on our property under false pretenses. The thought that they might have been plotting to harm or abduct my brother or me was a terror my young mind struggled to comprehend. Throughout our childhood, my parents shielded us from the full extent of Jane and her mother's fixation. It wasn't until our teenage years that we learned of the stalking, the break-ins, and the potential kidnapping attempts. Reflecting on those years, I often wonder how many times they watched us from the shadows, attended our school events unnoticed, or followed us as we went about our lives, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking nearby. The weight of their obsession cast a long shadow over our family, a chilling reminder of how unrequited love and unresolved emotions can spiral into something truly terrifying. My aunt still remembers that night as if it happened yesterday. Even after nearly 30 years, the feeling of dread still clings to her memory, the way a nightmare lingers long after waking. She hadn't been the kind of person to believe in the supernatural or put stock in old wives' tales. But after what happened, she never felt the same in that house again. Back then, my cousin was only 3 years old, a bright, happy child with a wild imagination. She was at that age where playtime could stretch for hours, lost in her own world, talking to dolls, stuffed animals, or whatever games her young mind invented. It was cute at first, the way she chattered away in her little voice, making up stories. My aunt never gave it much thought, until my cousin started talking to Bobby. Bobby became a constant presence in their lives. It wasn't like an ordinary imaginary friend, the kind children grow out of after a while. My cousin treated Bobby as if he were completely real. She spoke to him throughout the day, laughed at jokes only she could hear, and made space for him everywhere, setting an extra plate at the table, leaving room on the couch so Bobby could watch television, making sure he had a place in bed next to her. At first, my aunt found it a little odd, but she wasn't the type to overreact. She went to the library and read a few books on child development, all of which assured her this was a normal phase, especially for only children. It made sense. My cousin had no siblings, and my uncle worked long shifts, sometimes at night. My aunt figured Bobby was just her way of filling the quiet moments, so she went along with it. She pretended to serve Bobby food, gave him space when my cousin asked, and never questioned it. It was harmless, she told herself, just a child's imagination. Then winter came. My uncle had just started a new job that required night shifts, which left my aunt and cousin alone in the house at night. The house itself wasn't particularly old or eerie, but it had a certain emptiness in the evenings when it was just the two of them. My aunt didn't like being alone, but she told herself there was nothing to be afraid of. It was just another night. That evening, she went through the normal routine: dinner, bath, bedtime story. As usual, my cousin insisted that Bobby be included in all of it. My aunt played along, tucking the blankets around both her daughter and the empty space beside her. "Time for bed," she said, before switching off the lamp and heading for the door. She had just reached the bottom of the stairs when she heard my cousin call out from her room. She had forgotten to turn off the main light. Sighing, my aunt turned around and started back up the stairs. Just as she reached the landing, the bedroom light switched off. She stopped mid-step. Her stomach dropped. Then, my cousin's voice came from inside the room, casual and cheerful. "It's okay, Mummy." Bobby turned it off. My aunt's body turned cold. She stood frozen at the top of the stairs, staring at the darkened doorway. The light switch was on the opposite side of the room, too high for a 3-year-old to reach. There was no way my cousin had done it. Her hands trembled as she pushed the door open. The room was dark, but she could make out her daughter, still tucked into bed, lying on her side as if nothing unusual had happened. My aunt's breath came uneven, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to run. She wanted to snatch my cousin up and leave the house, but there was nowhere to go. The roads were icy, and my uncle was at work. She had no choice but to stay. Swallowing her fear, she stepped inside and forced her voice to stay calm. She said goodnight again, acting as if nothing was wrong. Then she turned and walked, quickly but without running, back downstairs. She sat on the couch, heart pounding, her hands clutching the phone. It took her 3 tries to dial my uncle's number. The moment he answered, he could tell something was wrong. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. She tried to explain, but the words felt ridiculous. "The light turned off by itself," she said, feeling absurd even as she said it out loud. She said Bobby did it. My uncle didn't laugh. He heard the fear in her voice and immediately asked his supervisor if he could leave early. While waiting for him to come home, my aunt sat in the living room, too afraid to move. Every noise in the house made her jump. The sound of the wind against the windows, the faint creaks of the house settling, all of it sent chills down her spine. She wanted to check on my cousin, but she couldn't bring herself to go upstairs. If something had caught fire, if an emergency had happened, she wasn't sure she would have had the courage to go back up there. That's how deep the fear had settled into her bones. When my uncle finally arrived home, she felt an immense wave of relief. He searched the house, checking locks, looking for explanations, but there was nothing. No loose wiring, no sign of a draft that could have caused the switch to move. The light wasn't faulty. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. The next morning, my aunt sat my cousin down for a serious talk. She told her that Bobby wasn't allowed to stay anymore, that she wasn't to play with him anymore. My cousin looked sad. Bobby doesn't want to leave, she said. My aunt, her nerves still raw, snapped. He has to. For the next few days, my cousin didn't mention Bobby. My aunt felt relieved. Whatever had happened that night, it seemed to be over. Then, one afternoon over lunch, she casually asked, "What happened to Bobby?" My cousin barely looked up from her plate. "He left," she said simply. A strange sense of unease crept up my aunt's spine. She hesitated before asking, "Why did he leave?" This time, my cousin did look up. Her little face was unreadable, her expression one of complete innocence. "Bobby said he was leaving because of the bitch." My aunt's breath caught in her throat. Her stomach turned, nausea creeping up as she stared at her daughter, who had already gone back to eating as if nothing had happened. A 3-year-old doesn't just come up with a word like that. My aunt struggled to keep her voice steady. "Where did you hear that word?" My cousin shrugged. "That's what Bobby said when he left. He said, 'I'm leaving because of the bitch.'" My aunt felt physically sick. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. She never pressed further. She didn't want to know more. From that day forward, my cousin never mentioned Bobby again. She played like a normal child, talked to dolls, watched her favorite cartoons. It was as if Bobby had never existed. But my aunt never forgot. Even now, when she tells the story, she can't explain it. She doesn't try. She only knows that something had been in that house, something she couldn't see. And when she forced it out, it hadn't been happy about it. Even after all these years, she still refuses to talk about it after dark. I used to live alone in a small, upstairs one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much, just a simple space with a tiny kitchen that opened into a living room, a small balcony I never used, and a bedroom just big enough for a bed and a dresser. The bathroom was tucked into the back, next to a closet I barely touched. It was the kind of place you got because you needed something cheap and convenient, not because you loved it. My boyfriend at the time lived in the apartment directly below mine, so it wasn't like I was completely alone. But at night, when I locked my door and turned out the lights, it felt like I might as well have been the last person on Earth. The building itself was old, probably built in the 70s, and had that strange, slightly off feeling that old buildings tend to have. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and sometimes the wind made a strange whistling noise through the windows. It wasn't a bad place, just odd. Something about it felt unsettled, like it had absorbed too much history, too many lives passing through. The first time I heard it, I was already in bed, lights off, curled up under the blankets, drifting in that half-asleep state where the world starts to blur at the edges. It was soft at first, so quiet I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But then it came again, the sound of footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. Someone walking across my living room floor. I held my breath. The sound moved toward the balcony, then back again. A measured pace, like someone thinking, considering. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I told myself it had to be the downstairs neighbor, but my brain immediately rejected the idea. The sound wasn't muffled like it was coming from below. It was in my apartment, right there, just beyond the bedroom door. I wanted to get up, to check, to do something, but I couldn't. Fear pinned me to the mattress, paralyzed me in place. Every muscle in my body locked up. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the feeling, that awful, creeping awareness of being watched, of not being alone. I lay there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. The footsteps stopped. Nothing moved. I don't know how long I stayed awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening for anything, but eventually exhaustion won. I fell asleep. The next morning, in the light of day, it was easy to dismiss. Old buildings make noises. Wood settles. Pipes shift. I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I had heard something from outside. And then it happened again. And again. Always at night. Always when I was either in bed or in the bathroom. Never when I was standing in the living room, able to confront it. I told my boyfriend about it. He shrugged it off at first, saying it was just the building, but then one night, he stayed over. And he heard it too. We both lay there, silent, listening to the unmistakable sound of footsteps crossing my living room floor. His body tensed beside me. He wasn't sleeping after that. Nothing ever happened beyond that. No doors opened. No objects moved. Just the footsteps. I started dreading nighttime. Even though nothing ever came of it, the feeling was always there. That thick, pressing sense of presence, like walking into a room that someone just left, the air still charged with them. But the worst night was the one when I came home late. I had been out, I don't even remember where, but it was late enough that the apartment complex was mostly dark and quiet. I parked my car, climbed the stairs, pulled out my key, and unlocked the door. I pushed it open and froze in the doorway. The hair on my arm stood up. That feeling hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone was inside my apartment. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. But I knew. Every instinct, every survival alarm in my body went off at once. I wasn't alone. My eyes went straight to the balcony door. The light was on. I never used that balcony. Never even turned that light on. I should have turned around and left. Gone back downstairs, called someone, done anything but what I did. But my brain wasn't working logically. Fear didn't make me run, it made me react. I stepped inside and hit the lights. Nothing moved. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. But the feeling didn't go away. Something was here. I didn't hesitate. I went straight for the kitchen counter and grabbed the first knife I saw. My hands were shaking. I wasn't thinking about how stupid I probably looked, standing there, barefoot, clutching a knife like I had any idea how to use it. It didn't matter. It was instinct. I turned slowly, scanning the space. From where I stood, I could see the balcony was empty. The front door was still open behind me, my car keys in the lock. That left 3 places: the bathroom, the closet, the bedroom. I don't know why, but the closet was the one that scared me the most. Maybe because I never used it. Maybe because it was the one place where someone could be hidden, crouched in the dark, waiting. I forced myself to move. I checked the bathroom first. Empty. I checked the bedroom. Empty. The closet. I had to force my feet forward. Every part of me screamed to just leave it alone. Close the bedroom door and pretend it didn't exist. But I had to. I had to know. I pressed my back against the wall, reached out, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just the empty, dark space. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to set the knife down on the dresser. I knew there wouldn't be anyone there, but I also knew I hadn't imagined it. That feeling, that gut-deep certainty that something had been in my apartment. It didn't go away, not even as I forced myself to lock the door and turn off the balcony light. I barely slept that night, my body on high alert, waiting. The footsteps continued after that. Not every night, but enough. I stopped trying to explain them. I never figured out why the light had been on. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was moved. But I knew, and I never stopped knowing.